War, 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 war. It never changes. Underground vaults protected their inhabitants from the horrors of war, and when they opened, they began to form new societies and tribes. The American Southwest would unify under the new California Republic, and as their needs grew, they sought to expand across the Mojave. Tales mentioned of an untouched city and a large wall on the Colorado River. The NCR now occupies Hoover Dam and has restored its glory, but elsewhere, an army of slaves has risen, known as Caesar's Legion. 4 years of war between the NCR and Legion has been fought. Despite this, the New Vegas Strip remains in operation, overseen by the mysterious Mr. House. It's inhabited by rehabilitated tribals and police robots. A courier is hired by the Mojave Express to deliver a package to New Vegas, but a simple job turns sour after he is captured and bound. He sees his captors are some con ruffians and a sharply dressed man. Tossing his cigarette aside, the checkered suit pulls out a poker chip saying this is the final delivery. He apologizes for getting the courier roped into the mess before pulling out a handgun. He aims the barrel and says,
"Truth is, the game was rigged from the start."
The last thing he sees is a muzzle flash before he meets God. But he doesn't see anything. No God, no devil. This is because the world of Fallout New Vegas is a godless one. Unseen, unprotected, and ungoverned. Unless you count comedic timing, of course. The courier jolts awake with a splitting migraine. The older man caring for him is Doc Mitchell and tells him he was out for a couple days. Doc asks if the courier knows his own name, and he thinks it was Jackson. Doc says his welcome to Good Springs was having his head opened up to have the lead inside removed. He says he is a skilled surgeon, but worries he wasn't perfect and asks Jackson to confirm his pieces, handing him a Robco Reflectron. Jackson sees a Chinese-American man in his late 50s staring back at him. Helping him to his feet, albeit still shaky, Doc wants Jackson to walk over to the Vitomatic Vigor Tester. Activating the machine, it reads out he's agile enough to walk on water and has an unstoppable endurance. If he weren't living as a courier today, he could have lived another life as the Dux Enius of the Fire Force. Doc invites Jackson to sit on his couch to ask him more questions. He begins with word association and then asks for his natural responses, followed by a round of Rorschach ink blots. His results indicate Jackson has a history involving guns, science, and sneaking. Before leaving, Doc has him fill out a form of his medical history. The only one he checks off is called Wild Wasteland, which means Jackson is prone to having schizophrenic visions. Seeing him to the door, Doc gives Jackson his belongings, including the Mojave Express Delivery Order 6. He confesses to looking through Jackson's belongings for a next of kin and ended up reading about a platinum chip. If he plans to continue his work, Doc provides him with a Pip-Boy 3000, a Pip glove, and a Vault 21 jumpsuit. He recommends talking to Sunny Smiles in the saloon to learn about surviving in the desert, or Victor, the metal fella who pulled Jackson out of his grave. But Jackson has one goal in mind: find the men who tried to kill him. And he reads his delivery order again. It says to deliver the package to the entrance of the New Vegas Strip and meet an agent at the checkpoint for a delivery fee. He must then bring the cash back to the Mojave Express in Prim. The package contained one oversized poker chip made of platinum. Opening the door of Doc Mitchell's house, Jackson is greeted by a blinding light. As his eyes adjust, he sees a small town in the desert sands. As he walks over to the Prospector Saloon, Jackson meets Easy Pete sitting outside. He tells Jackson about the men who attacked him, saying Fancy Pants with the cold eyes is the shot caller. Jackson asks Easy Pete about his name, and he tells him about his time as a prospector. Nowadays, he's easygoing, caring for Brahmin and bighorners. He didn't pan for gold and silver, though, but old tech and supplies, until he left the NCR. He says they're good people, overbearing, but they do keep the Legion away. The slavers led by Caesar tried to take Hoover Dam, but the NCR pushed them back. But they also didn't end them, so... He says there are stories of the Legion preparing for a second assault in a base somewhere on the Nevada side of the river. Pete says Hoover Dam holds clean water, and whoever owns the dam owns the territory. Jackson then asks about Victor, and he says he's just a broken down relic of a machine. But Trudy thinks he's hiding something. Entering the saloon, Jackson is greeted by Cheyenne, the guard dog, and her owner, Sunny Smiles. She agrees to help him learn the basics of survival, and she takes him out back. She hands him a varmint rifle and instructs him to shoot the sarsaparilla bottles, and he lands every shot. Sunny asks him to help remove some geckos from the water supply, and he's happy to oblige. For keeping his word, she hands Jackson 50 caps and says she can also teach him about living off the land. She sends him out to find xander root at the schoolhouse and a brock flower growing in the graveyard. On his walk back into town, Jackson has his first vision of a skeleton laying in a fridge. When he picks up the skeleton's suave gambler hat, it has Indie sewn into the inner lining. Looking around, Jackson meets Victor, a robot called a Securitron with the personality of a cowboy, and thanks him for digging up his body. Victor explains he was out at night when he heard some strange noises at the bone orchard, and he dug Jackson up to see if he was still alive after the bad eggs had left. Jackson then digs up some Xander roots and plucks a Brock flower, but when he passes his own gravesite, he takes notice of the distinctive cigarette butts. Returning to Sunny at the campfire site, she teaches him about making healing powder with the items he collected. She tells him it's also possible to do the same thing with guns and ammunition at a workbench. Before he heads back, she asks Jackson to meet with Trudy, the bartender, or better known as the town mom. When Jackson returns to the saloon, he sees Trudy in an argument with a man named Joe Cobb. He's demanding for Ringo to be handed over, or his friends will burn the town to the ground. Hearing this, Trudy doesn't budge a muscle and instructs him to leave. After the riffraff, she tells Jackson that Ringo, the traitor, entered town saying he had survived an attack and needed a place to hide. The town agreed to help, but didn't actually believe he was being hunted. He's currently inside the abandoned gas station, and she personally wants him to leave quietly, bringing the powder gangers with him. But the rest of the town would probably stand up for him. The powder gangers are chain gangs of prisoners brought in by the NCR to work on the rail lines. But after a large breakout, they have access to explosives. Jackson then asks her if she knows about his attackers, and she calls them freeloaders that expected to get a free drink. Trudy did get them to pay, but one of the Great Khans busted her radio by accident. She says they were talking about where they were headed until the guy with the checkered suit silenced them. From what she could hear, they came from the north through Quarry Junction, but doubts they went back that way because it's been overrun by critters. She did hear the leader talk about the strip and thinks the only way back would be from the east via Highway 93. Jackson then asks her opinion on Victor, and she says he normally just kept to himself and rolled around town, having never helped anyone before. He was already in town when she took over the bar, but others say his owner once lived in town, but no one knows who it was. Trudy says he acts friendly, but she finds his cheerful cowboy act creepy. Jackson asks about the news around the Wasteland, and she says the biggest news is always about the dam. She knows the NCR wants to produce electricity, but doesn't know what the savages want for it. She describes the Legion as killers dressed in Roman attire, and are rumored to be bigger than people know. When Jackson steps foot in the gas station, he's held at gunpoint by Ringo. Jackson says he's not looking for trouble, and he suggests they start again, over a game of Caravan. He gives a quick explanation, saying it's a 2-player card game where each player builds a caravan from their deck. He says beating the opponent requires more strategy than luck, and is the reason it's not found in casinos. It's too slow, and has no house edge. He hands Jackson a holotape with more in-depth rules and his spare deck. Jackson then asks where he can find more cards to add, and Ringo says they'll be lying around or even sold. The two sit and play around. With Ringo wagering 52 caps, Jackson matches the bet. Caravan is a game built from the decks of traditional playing cards, and duplicate cards may be played from multiple sets. 2 players build 3 opposing caravan piles to outbid the opponents while maintaining a value between 21 and 26. Each player must start by drawing 8 cards and playing a numerical card or an ace on each caravan. They cannot be discarded. After both players have started their caravans, they will take turns doing one of the following actions. 1. Play 1 card and redraw. 2. Discard 1 card and redraw. Or 3. Disband 1 caravan by removing all cards from the pile. Note, a rule that is not mentioned in the holotape that is important to know is as follows. Players may play their cards on both caravan sets. Caravans are assigned a suit determined by the first card played on a caravan, and an ascending or descending order numerically by the second. All cards played must follow the order or match the suit, but it can never be the same number value. Face cards are played with various effects as follows. Jokers can be played on all aces, numbered cards, and in repetition. If played on an ace, it will remove all numbered cards of the ace's suit. If played on a number, it removes all cards valued at the same number except for the played number. Jacks can be played on aces and all numbers. Doing so removes the played card and any attached face cards. Queens can be played on aces, numbered cards, and in repetition. Doing so reverses the current direction and changes the suit to that queen's. Kings can be played on aces, numbered cards, and in repetition. The value is determined by doubling the multiplicative value of the last played number. Once the caravan reaches the target value, the caravan is sold. But the other player may continue to outbid with their opposing caravan while still remaining in the target value. When all 3 competing caravans are sold, the game ends. If opposing caravans are tied, the bidding must continue. The player with 2 or more sales wins. Wrapping up their game, Jackson wins his first ever round, 2 caravans to 1. Jackson returns to business and asks Ringo about his plan against the powder gangers. He says he plans to lie low because he can't do it alone, so Jackson offers to help. Ringo says he'll just end up back in the grave, but if the whole town helped, it might work. Jackson says he'll corral the town, and Ringo recommends Sonny be his first catch. Jackson returns to Sonny and tells her about the plan to help Ringo. Without a second of thought, she agrees. Sonny tells Jackson about key individuals and says if he can convince Trudy, the rest of town will follow. Easy Pete has a collection of dynamite, Chet received a shipment of armor, and Doc might spare some of his stimpaks. He goes to speak with Trudy first, and she already knows about the plan. Jackson explains that it's supposed to be an ambush, and liking the idea, she says she'll rope in others around town to lend their guns. Jackson then talks to Easy Pete, and he says the dynamite is too dangerous, and it's better to just keep it buried. Jackson scoffs, saying it can't be hard to just toss a stick, and Pete says he'll blow up the town instead. Entering the Good Springs General Store, he meets Chet, but he's stingy in the sense he never voted to fight the powder gangers and will need an investment of 1,000 caps up front. Jackson tries to talk him down, saying the town is worth more, but he doesn't budge. Lastly, talking to Doc, he's put into a somber mood, saying folks should leave each other alone. He hands Jackson some stimpaks, but says he won't be able to help in the actual fight due to his bad leg. Returning to Ringo, Jackson says everything he could gather is all set. Just then, Sonny bursts through the door and says the powder gangers are attacking. There are 6 men, including Joe Cobb. The 3 of them run to join the rest of the town ambush. As the fight between the 2 opposing sides wages, the town of Good Springs comes out victorious, but not without losing the lives of Trudy and Cheyenne. Having helped Good Springs, Jackson's standing in town grew, but the powder gangers now shun him. Ringo thanks him for helping and hands over 100 caps, saying that they were his Crimson Caravan funds. He felt it wasn't proper to give them away without seeing the job done first, but Jackson can find him again at the Crimson Caravan camp in the future. Looking to set out, Jackson heads toward the town of Prim. Along the way, he spots a crying man named Barton Thorne. He says his girlfriend is trapped by some geckos and needs help. He points at a radio tower at the end of the trail, and Jackson follows his finger. Ignore why it's day now. At the top of the hill, Jackson finds multiple skeletons and mangled corpses, and when he turns around, Barton is running up the hill behind him. He apologizes for tricking him into clearing out the geckos for him, and says he can now get to the hidden stash, after killing Jackson. He goes to look for the loot himself, avoiding bear traps, until he has another vision of a man with 5 aces. Hearing an explosion in the distance, Jackson turns to see Victor is rolling up the hill too. He says he could smell danger, and Jackson finds it impressive for someone without a nose. He asks if Victor is following him, and he says he feels responsible to look after him. Jackson says he can take care of himself, but the robot insists everyone needs help, and he might return the favor. Jackson asks if he owes him a debt, and Victor doesn't say no. He continues onward and sees a town ahead of him, but when Jackson is stopped at the gate by an NCR trooper, he says Prim is off limits. Convicts have taken over the town and everyone is either dead or in hiding. Jackson asks why they aren't doing anything to protect it, and he responds saying they want to, but it's not in their jurisdiction, and they wouldn't be able to anyway due to the lack of equipment and men. Jackson manages to sneak into Prim unharmed. Son of a bitch. Son of a bitch! That is comedic timing at its finest. And makes his way into the Vicky and Vance casino. Just inside the door, he meets Johnson Nash, who introduces himself first as Ruby Nash's husband, and secondly, as a trader running the Mojave Express. Jackson tells him about losing his package, and he says he could help if he still has the delivery order. Jackson shows Johnson Order 6, and he recognizes it as one of the strange packages. He says he didn't refuse the order because of the large payout, and explains that a cowboy robot placed an order for 6 couriers, each carrying a different object. A pair of dice, a chess piece, and so on. Last he heard, all 5 of the other orders were completed, but the first hire for Jackson's turned down the job when he saw his name in the list of subs. Johnson says the other courier said the Mojave will sort him out. He doesn't know who he was or where he went, but suspects they have a history. Jackson then asks if he happened to see his attackers, and he says that one of the town's scavs saw a man in a daisy suit talking about a chip. The only person who knows now is Deputy Beagle, but he's currently being held captive in the Bison Steve. Jackson walks over to a Protectron with a cowboy hat dubbed Prim Slim. He's the spokespot for the Vicky and Vance Casino and Museum. He tells Jackson they were a celebrity outlaw couple who started their lives of crime before Bonnie and Clyde, but they only did minor petty crimes. They met their end after being shot in the crossfire between the cops and some bank robbers. He says their death car and Vance's machine gun are showcased in the museum, and when Jackson goes to take a look, the car is present, but the gun is long gone. A Upon leaving the casino, he sees a man lying dead in the street. On the corpse of Daniel Wyand, he finds the Mojave Express Order 4. Everything in the order matches Jackson's, except for the actual package, which was 2 oversized fuzzy dice. Jackson enters the Bison Steve and sees convicts patrolling the front entrance.
Peekaboo!
Really? Oh my
Peekaboo.
god. Oh my
Peekaboo.
god.
Peekaboo! Peekaboo! Peekaboo!
How the I can't keep track. Sneaking around, he finds a locked maintenance door and picks the lock. After taking out the convict guarding him, Jackson finds Deputy Beagle. He says he knows about his attackers and will only talk once he's freed. So Jackson unties his restraints, but Beagle says he's leaving. Jackson bars him from leaving and demands he stay, and Beagle thanks him for trying to be a bodyguard and sprints to the exit. Jackson follows him out the door, and he boasts about taking care of the convicts and escaping by himself. Jackson ignores his idiocy and asks about his attackers again. Beagle says while he was on reconnaissance for the powder gangers, he heard the suit talking about heading through Nipton to Novak to meet a contact. Beagle then asks if he can help find Prim's next sheriff, and Jackson points out it'd be him. But he says he can't be deputy if there isn't a sheriff first. He says it'd have to be someone brave, yet sedentary. Beagle then mentions hearing about a powder ganger named Myers who has some experience, but the NCR could just take over too. Across from Prim, Jackson enters Lieutenant Hayes' tent, and he talks about his business with holding the convicts back. He says they're lacking supplies, and the convicts are better off than the intel suggested. Despite having called for reinforcements, they have yet to arrive. The NCR Correctional Facility convicts staged a coup using the explosives that they were given to help clear boulders, hence their name. Jackson asks him about Prim's needs, and he acknowledges them, but doing so would leave them in an even worse standing. They need bodies, and even one squad would provide enough personnel. On the road to Nipton, Jackson is snuck up on by a man named Malcolm Holmes. He starts to say he wants to trade with him, then drops his facade. He says he's been following him for a while after he saw Jackson pick up a Blue Star Sunset Sarsaparilla cap, and because he didn't react to it, thinks Jackson doesn't know its true value. See, that's a lie. I did notice there exists a Wasteland legend of a before-war treasure, and the Blue Star caps are the key to obtaining it. No one knows what it is, but they do know it holds value to this day. He says the caps can be found everywhere, but the easiest place is from unopened sarsaparilla bottles. Malcolm says despite thinking that they'd all be opened by now, new bottles keep appearing. People believe Festus, the treasure's guardian who's been alive since the war, restocks the machines. Before Malcolm leaves, he advises Jackson to look out for a man named Alan Marks, because he's a notorious star killer. Following the road, Jackson can hear gunshots in the distance. A woman then runs up to him and says a man was going to kill her if she didn't do it first. He asks if she's alright, and Jacqueline explains how the man was psychotic, shouting about stars. Suspicious of her, Jackson sneaks a peek and pickpockets Jacqueline. Finding 9 star caps, he takes them off of her without her knowing. They continue to walk together, but when Jacqueline turns and fires her gun, yelling "Sucker!", Jackson pulls out his own. Of course it's a trap. As Jackson approaches the town of Nipton, he can see smoke billowing and fires burning. As he gets closer, he sees a man maniacally running toward him. Oliver Swanwick celebrates about winning the lottery, and Jackson asks if he's feeling okay. He says he's never felt better after winning the lottery. He runs off without saying anything more, and before Jackson can check his pockets. Because of this, Jackson completes a canon event and finds a lottery ticket on his corpse. Entering the town square, Jackson sees powder gangers strung up and crucified alive. As he approaches the police station, he sees men dressed as Roman soldiers and war dogs to match. Their leader introduces himself as Vulpes Inculta and assures Jackson he won't share the same fate, and is instead useful to him. He wants Jackson to commit to memory the site of Nipton and spread the word of Caesar's Legion's lesson. The lesson of Nipton's moral sickness having only serviced those who paid. Setting a trap for newcomers led them to falling victim themselves. Having gathered every townsperson, they told them they would punish the disloyal by lottery. Every person's ticket held their fate, but not one person did anything to stop them or resist the butchering, crucifixion, or burning of their fellow man. Jackson calls their crimes atrocities, and Vulpes says he's free to attack them, but he'd soon stop feeling anything, and leads his band of legionaries out of Nipton. Looking for survivors, Jackson enters the general store and meets boxcars. He says his leg is broken and calls Jackson the Powder Ganger's Grim Reaper. He says he won the second place prize, which was being left alive but after having his legs crippled by hammers. Jackson offers up some Med-X for the pain and says he and Swanwick survived through luck alone. Jackson asks about the lottery, and Boxcars explains how his crew had a plan with the town mayor to kidnap the NCR troops coming in for sex, but they found themselves surrounded by the Legion instead. They were gathered up, and Volpes proclaimed they were the bad people in need of punishment. Nipton drew tickets for lucky losers. First were decapitations, next were crucifixions, third place were enslaved, and then it was him and Oliver. Jackson asks about the mayor, and he says the mayor was burned alive. He then says those who were enslaved were dragged to the east, and Jackson says he'll try to free them, but Boxcars responds apathetically. Walking around town, Jackson has a vision of two burnt corpses whose souls now join the Skywalkers. Entering Nipton Hall, he finds the mayor's office and reads through Mayor Stein's terminal. In Prison Break, he writes about having the terminal built for the price of a night with just one of his girls. He says he continues to earn money by prostitution and earning a cut from the shop's sales, and once he's earned enough, he's headed for the hub. Meanwhile, in High Roller, he reports on the escaped prisoners from the NCR correctional facility. He sent the Jims to tell the escapees that Nipton is open to trading with them. And in Testing, he reports about meeting a man called Mr. Fox. He told him he was part of the Legion and knew of Stein's deals with the NCR and the Powder Gangers. He wanted to use Nipton as a trap for both groups, and Stein planned to use the Powder Gangers to kidnap the NCR. For accepting Mr. Fox's job, he was given 8,000 caps, and has since prepared himself a safe house between Nipton and the Mojave Outpost. Leaving Nipton, Jackson walks along the railroad and finds NCR Ranger Station Charlie. He meets Comm Officer Stepanak, and he informs him that McCarran doesn't like civilians in military outposts. But because of the spotty radio signal, they'd only find out from the person who's sent with supplies for the routine checkup. He says their station is responsible for the highway up through Novak, but it's currently quiet. Jackson then asks about the Rangers themselves, and he says it's a rigorous job, which requires stealth and ferocity. There's only but a couple dozen either stationed or on patrol, and they're a skillful troop drawn from the NCR Army, only after being nominated for training. Further along the railroad, Jackson can see a large model dinosaur in the distance. He passes through the broken fence line and enters Novak. Inside the motel lot, he finds Victor just standing around. He says he doesn't know why, but he was compelled to go to New Vegas. Jackson asks if he happened to see his attackers again, and he says he didn't, but the rest of the town might have. He first enters the Dino D-Light front desk area and meets Jeannie Mae Crawford. She welcomes him into town and offers up a room, but Jackson asks about the checkered-suited man. She says a sharp-dressed man with a sharp tongue knew Manny, their daytime sniper. He's normally on lookout in the dinosaur's mouth. Jackson walks over to the Dino Bite gift shop and is greeted by Cliff Briscoe, the store owner. He says if Jackson is looking for T-Rex figurines, he only has a few left, but Jackson asks about his other wares, and he mentions the T-Rexes again, and some Repcon factory souvenir rockets. Jackson asks if he has anything else for sale, and he says under his breath,
"Darn it, no one ever buys the T-Rexes."
Jackson asks about the rockets, and Cliff says they're scale replicas of the real rocket, and they glow from a liquid inside. They used to be given out at Repcon on tours of the HQ in Henderson, but they had to stop when kids started drinking the contents and developed the Repcon shakes. The replicas were then offloaded to Dino Bite as a tax write-off. Looking through his storefront, Jackson sees that Cliff has a stock of 1,000 T-Rexes. Walking upstairs, Jackson instead meets Boone in the mouth of the dino. He's startled to see anyone enter, and tells him to leave. Jackson tries to say he's making friendly conversation, but Boone has no friends in Novak. But when Jackson says he's not from Novak, he tells him not to leave, and instead needs the trust of a stranger. His wife was taken by Legion slavers at night while he was on watch. They knew how to avoid his detection and only took Carla, so it has to be an inside job, but he doesn't know who did it. Boone wants him to find the person and bring them in front of the nest while he's on duty, and then put on his NCR beret as the signal. He wants to do it himself. Handing him the beret, Jackson asks how he's certain of his wife's death, and he just says, "I know." Walking downstairs, Jackson asks Cliff about Boone's wife, and he says they never really talked much because she only entered the store once. Entering Ranger Andy's bungalow, the two men begin talking. He says Boone's wife was taken, and Andy believes he'll never be the same. He did ask the Rangers at Station Charlie to watch out for the perpetrators, but the area's too big. Asking about Carla, he says she was beautiful, but never held her tongue about the poor services in town. Jackson then notices his leg, and he says because of it, it's the first time he's been removed from the Rangers, and now he feels useless. While on a mission looking for Legion slavers, he found a child hiding in a closet. When he reached out to help him, the kid recoiled and ignited a grenade. He says he likes to call the station over the ham radio, but because they haven't responded recently, he asks Jackson to check up on them. Entering Manny Vargas's room, Jackson finds a terminal in his room with a file called Con Hospitality. Skimming it over, the file says Benny has been twitchy after stealing his boss's package, but he was reassured after hearing they were making a stop in Novak on the way to Boulder City. Outside, Jackson talks with Daisy Whitman. She says she misses flying as a vertibird pilot, but today she helps strip them for complicated salvage because the pieces pay better than the whole thing. When he asks if she flew for the NCR, Daisy just chuckles to herself. In the next room, Bruce Isaac immediately begs for his life, then asks if Jackson is working for Mr. Bishop because he looks like one of his usual mercs. Clearing up the misunderstanding, Jackson recognizes Bruce as a club singer from New Reno at the Shark Club. He's in Novak now on the run from Bishop because he owed him money, and Bruce took what he was rightfully owed. And he also had sex with his daughter. Jackson tips his hat to that, but if he's found without enough money, he'll be castrated. Jackson then offers to help him find work. Back at the front desk, Jackson talks with Jeannie about Boone. She says he's distraught over losing his wife, but she believes Carla wasn't kidnapped, but ran off instead. Weird. That's... okay. Jeannie describes her like a cactus flower. Admirable, only at a distance. She always preferred the bustle of New Vegas, and probably left. Jackson, upon leaving, immediately inspects her house, only to find everything is normal, except for a fridge with a lock on it. Jackson then enters the McBride house where he meets Alice McBride. She says she has only met Carla once or twice and wants to know them better. The people of Novak tend to keep to themselves, much to Jeannie's dismay, but she appreciates her efforts regardless. There are some who do pry though, and she mentions Nobark was in their yard last week. She thought it was their cow killer, but Alice knows he's harmless because he sees things differently. His name was originally used as a pejorative, but he soon took a liking to it. Or he just doesn't remember his real name. She introduces Jackson to Dusty, her husband of 50 years, and says they set up their ranch when Novak was just starting. Asking Dusty about Boone's wife, he also says that he doesn't know them too well, but remembers she has an edge to her. He tells Jackson about being a rancher, but his animals have been attacked at night recently. Every night, around midnight, he's awoken by the sound of screaming and gunshots, finding a Brahmin laying dead, but untouched. Jackson says he'll keep an eye out, and Dusty says he'd appreciate it if he did it before the whole herd is killed, but doesn't want him to get hurt in the process. He avoids confronting the perp because of Nobark's recount, but thinks they're from out of town because they always shoot from the west. Jackson, looking for Nobark, pops his head inside his shack, finding a non-functioning defense system with an unrigged shotgun aimed at his head. But he does find Nobark Noonan outside, and he starts saying, "Who sent you?" Jackson tries to assure him he won't harm him, but Nobark says he would, using Old Sticky. Keeping him an arm's length away, Jackson says distance is good, but Nobark says he can't hear him. Jackson repeats about Nobark stabbing him, and he tells Jackson to speak up, but not too loudly because people are listening in. Whispering, he says he got his name because his words have bite, but no bark. He doesn't trust the non-irregular because they like to keep secrets. Asking about Novak, he says the town has seen ghouls at the rocket factory, but believes they're just imagining it because they're actually commie ghosts that don't know they're dead. He saw one disappear in front of him, but he doubts it was real because he's a scientist. He then tells Jackson about the McBride Corral's unnatural deaths coming from a chupacabra. The town chooses to ignore what he says because there's bullet holes, but he knows it's a chupacabra with an automatic. While he was busy investigating a gecko's treasure, he saw it. He thinks it had 2 heads and long fangs because it was invisible, but it also had a rotating blunderbuss connected to a backpack. He adds it was having an argument with more invisible chupacabra. Then Jackson asks about Boone's wife. He says he saw everything. Shadows entered Boone's room and left in the night, but he did see them enter the lobby once. He says the people responsible are mole rat men who lure in women using money, collecting their hair because they're bald. Waiting for the D-Light lobby to close and Jeannie to leave, Jackson picks the lock to a safe behind her desk. Inside, he finds a holotape called Bill of Sale. It's a receipt documenting the purchase of one slave, Carla Boone, from Jeannie Mae Crawford for 1,000 caps and 500 for the unborn child, with 500 more if the fetus matures. Checking the time, Jackson, before midnight, goes to observe the Brahmin Corral. At exactly midnight, he sees a warbling figure in the distance. When it becomes visible, he sees a Nightkin with a large minigun. Jackson shoots and kills the Nightkin, finding a holotape on his corpse labeled The Screams of Brahman. It's journal entries of Brahman screaming in his head when he tries to sleep. Reporting this to Dusty, he thanks Jackson by giving him 75 caps and some free Brahman steaks. Next, Jackson wakes Jeannie and invites her to see something in front of the dinosaur. They walk to the meeting point, and Jackson talks with Jeannie one last time before putting on Boone's beret. Jesus! Holy shit! Reporting back to Boone, he asks how he knows if it was the right person, and Jackson shows him the bill of sale. He thanks Jackson with 100 caps and says their deal is done. Boone plans on leaving town to hunt legionaries, so Jackson asks to join him to kill even more. He agrees to the idea, but says it isn't a good one. On a trek back, Jackson travels to Station Charlie, and when he walks in... Oh. Oh, shit. Was that under him? Hold on. I kind of want to see that. Oh, that is so well hidden. I guess you have to drag the body, because otherwise you're not going to be able to see it every time. Yank body. Well... Jesus! Every time. Is there like a wire there? There is a wire, okay. How do I disarm this one, though? Son of a bitch! I'll leave it to my dumbass to... Oh yeah, I'll be really smart. I can jump while crouched. Okay, if I have my head pointed down... Damn it! Damn it! How... Activate tripwire. Okay, so I have to look over there, I guess? Don't activate. What was that? Did you see the little hop that my character did? Oh! Don't stop! Stop! Ooh, your repair is not high enough to interact with the trap. Wait right there.
I'll sit tight.
Oh, shit. How am I gonna get back across? Fuck. Okay, this is gonna get hairy. Do not fucking walk. Is there a way that I can direct you? Be aggressive. Oh, back up. Sweet. No. Stop. Okay. Reload. Fucking... I've done this twice now in some of these games. He reports what he saw there to Ranger Andy, and he says this could lead to trouble for everyone. To the southwest, Jackson spots two large statues shaking hands atop a hill. As he gets closer, he learns it's the Mojave Outpost. Reading the plaque, it's called the Unification Monument, marking the history of the signing of the Ranger Unification Treaty between the Desert Rangers of Nevada and the NCR for the protection of Hoover Dam, New Vegas, and southern Nevada against Caesar's Legion. In the area, he tells Sergeant Kilborn about the Legion's attack on Nipton. In disbelief, he says they are doomed, but appreciates the bad news. Entering the Outpost HQ, Jackson meets Major Knight. He asks Jackson for his identification so he can put it into his logbook, to which he answers Courier. He reports about Prim's need for help, but he says he can't spare any more units due to the order from out west. On his walk back, Jackson sees a legionary campsite with the two hostages from Nipton. Jackson and Boone kill the captors and free the two powder gangers, resulting in him being shunned by the Legion. Back in Novak, Jackson heads west toward the Repcon facility, finding a radiated ghoul's body on the ground. Walking up the hill, he sees more feral ghouls walking around. I get experience for you taking them out? Continuing down the road, he finds Nightkin and some ghouls in robes lying dead. And farther beyond, he can see the Repcon facility buildings. The fuck is that? Stepping foot inside, Jackson is shouted at from an intercom by a raspy voice telling him to find a big room in the building and climb the stairs. When Jackson asks who's calling, the voice says it doesn't matter to a smooth skin. Looking for the right room, Jackson needs to clear the path first. Well, that works. But then he finds an employee terminal and reads a message from the project manager stating that RepCon is merging with Robco. Finding the correct room, he climbs the staircase to another intercom. The voice says he's letting Jackson in, but he needs to watch himself. Walking into the RepCon research labs, Jackson sees a human-looking person with the same voice. Chris Haversam calls Jackson ugly and tells him to meet with Jason. He's surprised Chris wasn't a ghoul, and he says Jackson's pranks won't work on him or Jason. Confused, Jackson calls his smooth-skinned comment ironic, only to be met with Chris telling him to stop wasting his time. As he walks away, Jackson sees other ghouls wearing the same bright Brotherhood robes. He finds himself talking with a glowing ghoul with an ethereal voice. Jason Bright apologizes for seeing them living in the facility, because their true home is in the far beyond. He asks Jackson if he will help them complete the Great Journey. Jason says he is the prophet of the Great Journey and his flock members. He wishes to escape the Wasteland away from the violence and bigotry of humans. He was promised a new land by the Creator in the far beyond, and describes the far beyond after having a miraculous vision of healing light. Jackson asks how they'll make the journey, and he says through faith. Preparations were almost complete until the demons appeared, and says they were attacked when they went to their morning worship by invisible beings. Half of his flock was lost, and those remaining retreated to the surface. The demons haven't attacked since, but they have heard them raving below. He asks if Jackson can help drive the demons away, and he agrees. Jason praises the Creator and thanks Jackson, giving him the key to the RepCon basement. Before Jackson leaves, he asks about the other human, and Jason doubts he was successful telling Chris that he was human because he also tried when Chris first arrived. He believes himself to be a ghoul, and now Jason sees him as a gift from the Creator. Unlocking the door to the RepCon basement, Jackson meets the Nightkin leader Davison talking to an animal skull. He wants to kill Jackson, but Antler convinces him not to. Jackson asks why he sounds odd, and Davison tells him he's guided by Antler while he guides his kin. Jackson then asks who Antler is, and he becomes agitated. Again, Antler calms him down, and Davison tells Jackson to refer only to him. Jackson then asks about Davison, and he says he's a devotee of Antler, but before, he was the captain of the Nightkin under the Master. They wandered the desert and others had their minds broken until he found Antler. Now, all is well. Jackson points at the Brahmin skull and asks if that's who Antler is. Davison then threatens him with his final warning. Jackson says he can help him, and he asks Antler why the Nightkin were brought to the facility. Davison then says he read a shipment invoice about hundreds of stealth boys being sent to this facility. He believes they're all in one room, but they can't search it because a tough ghoul is set up inside with guns and traps. Davison locked the door to keep his kin out while he waits for Antler's next message. Jackson is the solution. He agrees to look for the stealth boys if the Nightkin agree to leave. After some deliberation, Davison says Antler agrees and gives him the key to the locked ghoul room. Opening the door with the dead Nightkin at his feet, Jackson meets the ghoul sniper Harland. He stops himself from shooting Jackson when he realizes he's a human. He tells Harlan that Jason sent him to rid the demons, and he retorts that it must have been the Creator's will that Jackson appeared instead of Jason. While he was on escort duty, the Nightkin attacked, and he was sent to retrieve any survivors. Harlan says he couldn't find any and instead ended up trapped himself. Jackson asks why he's different from the Brights, and Harlan says he doesn't buy into their religion, but he stays for the Ghoulettes. He's since survived down here uncomfortably, living off rad roach meat and condensation from the pipes. Jackson asks how he can help, and he says that he had a friend who panicked and ran below. Harlan already assumes she's dead, but he won't leave until he's confirmed it, and he can't do that because of the Nightkin. Because it takes some precise timing in a specific order, Jackson enters speedrun mode. He sneaks below, avoiding the Nightkin jailer using a stealth boy, then picks a lock to the lowest levels, finds a key in a desk, unlocks the cell door, and finds a ghoul prisoner, and then returns to Harlan, all without harming a single Nightkin. Telling him about his friend, he says he'll miss her yellow smile, and allows Jackson to search the room while he runs upstairs. Jackson finds a terminal in the room with a couple of entries. In an email titled Shipment Mistake, the author tells of RepCon receiving 2 crates of 2 gross of stealth boys by mistake. Then, a notice is sent out called Workplace Misbehavior. After an event, all employees are required to read RepCon's sexual harassment policies, and while not stated in the employee handbook, the use of military hardware against employees will result in termination. The last email lists 2 crates of stealth boys are being returned, one full, the other missing 5 due to being opened and mishandled. Jackson reports his findings to Davison, telling him the stealth boys are gone. He calls Jackson a liar because the invoice said so and Antler read it to him. Jackson tries to explain it better and Davison struggles to understand, but Antler believes him. Davison then says they'll follow Antler to the stealth boys' new location, and he leads the Nightkin out. Returning to Jason, Jackson tells him the demons are gone. He praises the creator and thanks Jackson, hoping he'll join his flock to their sacred site. Jackson follows the flock to see them wearing spacesuits in the lowest level. In another lab, he sees rocket ships behind a window. Jason says he wanted to talk with him one last time, and he says the rockets are missing some vital pieces. Jackson asks if the rockets are the Great Journey, and he says his visions confirm that the creator's will guide them. Jackson then swaps his qualms over to Chris. Jason tells him the whole story. When Chris first arrived, they tried to tell him he was human, but when he got angry, they let him stay. During that time, Jason learned that Chris's skills, ignorance of his own humanity, and him being unable to join the journey were actually beneficial. He says it isn't a coincidence that humans were vital for them to complete their journey. Jackson then realizes Chris is being left behind, and Jason says the creator showed him visions of Chris's death if he did, because of the massive radiation on the launch pad, and more so in the far beyond. Jackson calls Jason despicable for using Chris, and he says he would take him if it were not for the creator's will. Jason says his goodbyes to Jackson and Chris and descends onto the launch pad. Looking below, Jackson can see the rockets being worked on by the ghouls and a chimpanzee. Talking to Chris, he says he's the flock's resident engineer and he's useless without the right materials. Jackson asks why he isn't allowed to work on the launch pad, and he explains that Jason wanted him to supervise the repairs from above because it would be a waste to work on one project at a time. Jackson tries to tell him about the radiation being high enough to kill him, but Chris calls him a typical smooth skin for messing with him. He also used to be human when he lived in Vault 34, and then goes on to recount the bullying he experienced, saying he was forced to work on the reactor. After being exposed to the radiation, he was made ugly and would later lose all his hair. Jackson asks if his balding is what made him leave, and Chris says he isn't bald. He's a monster. Asking about the rockets, Chris tells him they're missing 2 components: Isotope 239 igniting agent and thrust control modules. The agent is highly radioactive and decays quickly, so he'll need to find an intact, shielded container of it, and the thrust modules were custom built, so they won't launch without them. Jackson chooses to look for the agent first, and Chris says Jason talked about some highly radioactive industrial ruins in the east. After surfacing, Jackson heads for the ruins, finding a scavenger's body in a radiation suit with Isotope 239 on his person, along with a holotape journal from Mr. Radical. On day 1, he says the rad suit allows him to scavenge anywhere, and decides to give himself the nickname. On day 4, he visited Yucca Mountain, a very radiated area, and he didn't feel a thing. On day 5, he reports that he vomited, but believes it just to be something he ate. On day 9, he bought a glowing container from an old woman's scrapyard. He plans to visit Clark's field to test the suit's full capabilities, and if he survives, he'll pour the goop straight onto himself. Jackson takes the agent with him. Returning to Chris, he says it must be intact because Jackson isn't dead. Then he tells him that scavs wouldn't know the true value of the modules, and tells him to ask junk dealers for them. Remembering Mr. Radical's journal, Jackson follows it to the Gibson scrapyard and sees some guard dogs outside. Inside, he meets Old Lady Gibson, as she starts rambling about selling scraps, and then says something about a building called Helios 1. Jackson asks her if she has the thrust modules, and she does, but they're marked at 500 caps, so he declines. He asks her about Helios 1, and she says the Brotherhood of Steel ran it before the NCR took it over, and then fled into silence. When they finish talking, Gibson lies down to sleep. Jackson then pickpockets a key off of her and unlocks a metal box with it. He finds the thrust modules inside it and steals them. Reporting back to Chris, he says the great journey can begin. He relays the message, and Jason gathers his flock. He gives a speech thanking the humans who helped them complete their journey, and calls Chris a saint. Jackson ascends and enters the test site. He starts the launch sequence, and the large dome opens up, revealing 3 rockets. As the smoke pours from the thrusters, the rockets blast off, and the ghouls complete their journey. Along the way, Jackson chooses to visit Helios 1. <sighs> Fuck it. My curiosity is getting the better of me. At its front door, Lieutenant Haggerty tells him the area is restricted and suspects he's a Legion spy. Concocting a lie, Jackson says he noticed the solar tower isn't working efficiently, and he can help fix that. She begins to say he's not needed because they already have an expert, then stops herself and says he's an idiot and Jackson might be better. Haggerty tells him to find an idiot wearing sunglasses inside the building. But before he leaves, Jackson asks why more people aren't stationed here. She explains the plant doesn't supply enough for any enemies to show interest in it. They did have a larger force when they took it from the Brotherhood of Steel, but they were called back to help with the dam. She doesn't know what the Brotherhood was doing here before, because when they fled, they activated the security system to keep the NCR away from the controls. Stepping inside of Helios, Jackson finds a terminal at the front desk. It gives a notice about the test of Archimedes, warning all staff not to be outside. It then says the test was a success, but minor systems were overloaded, and nearby facilities at Black Mountain and the Hidden Valley military bunkers had their systems fried. Jackson then finds a newsletter directed at the Poseidon Energy employees called Can I Tell Him? It states, while it is natural to want to share work experiences, all employees must not tell anyone. Can't tell their wives because a woman's tongue is the devil's plaything. Her and her friends will gossip all about it until a Chinese spy hears them, captures the employee, and suddenly China rules the world. Can't tell their children because the school bully, who's Russian, will get their lunch money and government secrets, forcing them to work in labor camps while you live with your now makeupless, homely wife. Can't tell your friends because even though your male friends are the only ones you can trust, what if they're comrades? The notice states that you are part of two families, but your obligations to the Poseidon family is greater, because they will always have your back. Even if your wife cheats, your kids are bad, and your friends change. But if anyone ever asks, the company is always looking for new talent. That's so funny. How can you yourself not, think of yourself as the villain when writing that? Entering the laboratory, Jackson finds the idiot. Fantastic asks if Jackson is replacing him, and he asks why he's worried. Fantastic says he isn't, because no one else can do what he does, and Jackson asks him to elaborate. He's in charge because the NCR depends on his power. Jackson, annoyed, wants exact details. He says he pushes buttons and turns dials, then makes up stories about what the numbers say. Jackson retorts he doesn't actually know what he's doing, but Fantastic says he does. Just not the effects of him pushing the buttons. Jackson, in disbelief, asks how he got the job, and he says it was easy after lying on his resume. Asking about what they're trying to accomplish, he says they're getting power, but it's only 1% because the mirrors outside aren't positioned correctly. The controls to operate them are on the tower, but the NCR set off the security system and won't approach it now. 2 terminals outside can retarget the mirrors, but he couldn't access them himself. Once those are fixed, he can use the mainframe on the tower. Jackson says he'll try to do it, but Fantastic tells him if he does, to send the power to the correct locations, the Strip and McCarran. Jackson asks why those locations, and he says, to get paid. The NCR wants it there, so he does too. Handing him a password to one of the terminals, Fantastic says he found it in one of the bathroom stalls. Avoiding some traps, Jackson accesses Terminal 1, clicks Reset Mainframe Connection, and the terminal reconnects. He then finds Terminal 2 is guarded by NCR dogs. But when he tries to use it, it's too hard to hack. Jackson then enters the Solar Collection Tower and is targeted by ceiling turrets, Protectrons, and Robo-Brains. He finds a Poseidon Energy employee ID card and puts it in his pocket. Finding the mainframe terminal, it's unresponsive due to insufficient power. However, in a nearby room with some robots, Jackson finds one named Python fitted with tools for industrial maintenance. He hardwires the robot to run on autopilot, and Python awakens, running over to fix the wiring to the main computer. Once it's finished, electricity flows into the mainframe system. Re-entering the power plant, Jackson meets Ignacio Rivas, who asks if he's a soldier or a scientist. Jackson says his reasoning is scientific, working to keep the peace, and Ignacio likes him. He says it's reassuring, but the followers of the apocalypse also said that. He confides in Jackson that they're headed for a danger no one realizes. With Jackson increasing the plant's power, it's only good if it's connected to a grid and not a weapon. Telling Jackson about the other terminal password, he says power is needed everywhere and distributing it evenly is the human choice. Asking what other things the plant provides, he saw records of weapon dealings, and the word Archimedes kept appearing. The technology reminds him of the Enclaves, but even more advanced, and a weapon made from that would be catastrophic. This was the reason the Brotherhood was hesitant to abandon the facility. Ignacio doubts they were at Helios for the electricity, because the Brotherhood of Steel's interests involve pre-war weapon technology. Jackson asks if the NCR knows about it, and he says no, because they hired an imbecile who's unknowingly spent all his time fixing the intercom system instead. Ignacio was sent in when the NCR took over the plant and was tasked with preventing the revival of dangerous technology. The NCR allows him to stay in hopes he'll give them some answers, but he continues to refuse. Asking about the followers of the apocalypse, he says, "We promised to bring back the knowledge of survival." Jackson asks if they work with the NCR, and he says they did, but the NCR only cares for personal gains, and the followers are just their cleaners now. The followers are scattered about, but their largest congregation is in Freeside at the old Mormon fort. Back outside, Jackson boots up Terminal 2 and resets the mainframe connection, completing the handshake process. Returning to the mainframe terminal, he reconfigures the power grid to the full region, and it says it's at insufficient capacity with brownouts likely. He tries to set it to the full region at emergency output level, but this time it says imminent system overload, so he reconfigures it back to the regular output. Finding the reflector control panel, it's unresponsive until peak sunlight hours between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. Jackson waits until the next day and activates the machine. The reflector turns on, and blinding light is directed at the tower. Reporting this to Ignacio, he says he saw Jackson sent the power to everyone, and with this, he hopes the NCR will be satisfied and will leave the plant alone. Thanking him, Ignacio gives him a book of science, some stimpaks, and doctor's bags. Having helped him, Jackson is now accepted by the followers of the apocalypse. Back on the trail, Jackson finds the lonesome drifter with his guitar resting near a billboard. Lonesome drifter. Howdy, partner.
Howdy there, partner.
He compliments his guitar, and the drifter says it was the only thing his father left him. But he left long ago, and his mother said he always moved in secret. It was just him and his mother living in Montana after his father left, but he always saw him as a stranger anyway. His mother was worked to the bone while he worked in the coal mines at 15. After she died, the drifter set out to find his father for some answers. He's unsure of what he'll do when he finds him though, and saying it out loud, he thinks he's a fool. So Jackson suggests he settle down. He asks if Jackson knows any places for a guitar player, and he promises to keep a lookout for him. Down the road, Jackson can see a bright light across the horizon of the night sky. He's looking at it. New Vegas. Walking into Boulder City, Jackson sees a soldier, Private Kowalski, looking at a memorial wall. He says it commemorates the Battle of Hoover Dam, of when the NCR Rangers lured legionaries into Boulder City and blew it up. His older brother died so others could evacuate the wounded. He's normally stationed at Camp McCarran, but is currently on leave to visit his family in California and plans to join the caravan on the 188. Approaching a barricade, Jackson is stopped by Lieutenant Monroe saying he's dealing with some great cons and was ordered to lock down the Boulder City ruins. One of their patrols was put under fire by the cons and later radioed for reinforcements. They chase the cons into the ruins where they have Private Ackerman and Private Gilbert held hostage. Jackson explains to him about his business with the platinum chip, and Monroe says once the cons are dealt with, he can search for his belongings. Jackson says he can try and sneak inside to free the hostages, and Monroe says once they're freed, the rest of the squad will support him. Entering the ruins, Jackson sneaks through the rubble of broken houses and picks a lock on a door. Finding the hostages, he sees they're tied together, so freeing one will free both of them. Untying their restraints, the hostages run out and some cons follow behind and shoot at Jackson. By killing the remaining cons, Jackson becomes vilified by their people. Entering the Great Con hideout, he kills Jessup and finds McMurphy is already dead. These are the other two of his attackers. Searching their bodies, Jackson finds a chairman job offer and an engraved cigarette lighter. Reading the job offer, a chairman from the Tops Casino is hiring, but the details are to be kept secret. There is a name to mention though. Benny. While he's scrounging around, Victor finds Jackson again. He says it's just him and Benny now, and he shouldn't worry about him. He believes he's made his way back to New Vegas, and when he gets there too, Victor will pay for Jackson's first round. Coming across the 188 trading post, he meets Michelle, who welcomes him to her slop and shop. Her and her father Samuel set up the store after they fled Prim. The 188 offers troops on the 93, and the NCR travels on the 95 when Legion raids are low, so the crossing is perfect. Turning to Samuel, he says they left Prim after the prison break, and the I-95 shut down barring any customers. But business here is better, because NCR gamblers use 95 to get to and from the strip. The lucky ones spend their new caps, while the unlucky ones are willing to trade anything for food. With the addition of troopers from McCarran to the dam, he doesn't miss Prim at all. Then Jackson meets a younger girl in raggedy robes named Veronica. She says Jackson looks weathered and asks where he's from. He answers back, the grave. And she says he looks pretty good then. She says she also lives in a hole in the ground, and then clarifies it's actually a bunker. But she normally spends more time outside getting supplies for her family. She says they can handle themselves, and if anything, prefer it when she's out. She then asks for a personal inquiry, and Jackson allows it. She had a run-in with the Brotherhood of Steel and asks if he knows of them. He says only in name, but doesn't like their ideals. Veronica agrees with him, saying old technology isn't relevant to most these days. She asks where Jackson's headed, and he says to see an old friend. Having traveled this far, she finds it to be an interesting relationship, and Veronica sees him as the only person capable of doing it. She then asks if they can travel together, but Jackson asks about her family. She says they can handle themselves, because it's a big family. He asks if she has any specific plans, and she says nowhere. But she does want to learn from other groups about surviving in the Mojave. Jackson comments on her appearance, saying she's not very threatening, and she says that's exactly the look she wanted to give, and to trust her. He wants to bring her along, but he can't. Hearing this, Veronica says she feels like a stray cat, but she's willing to wait for him. Jackson and Boone come across a resort complex that has been turned into a military camp. Jackson starts up a conversation with Mags, who grew up in New Reno and tried to become a ranger, but failed and is now stuck with a crew of jokers. They're good people, but they like to slack off, and that impacts her too. She says Camp Golf is where the fuck-ups are sent to, but she wanted to actually be something. Talking with Raz, he says he and his squad mates don't talk because Poindexter's a smartass, O'Hanrahan's a pussy, and Mags just isn't a soldier. Asking Poindexter if he's in charge, he says he isn't the official one, but the others look up to him because of his intelligence. Jackson just stares back at him. Entering the war tent, Jackson meets Sergeant McCready. He says he's been in Camp Golf since the first push into Vegas, but is now stuck trying to discipline the softies. Jackson asks if he's disappointed in his troops, and he says they're called the Misfits for a reason. Although the squad leader Mags shows promise. Jackson offers to help, and McCready thinks they will listen to someone less authoritative. Returning to Poindexter, Jackson tells him he's their new teacher, and he says it's illogical. He was hoping to just coast by on mediocrity instead. He says Jackson could instead enter the resort, hack the computer, and alter the company reports. But that would increase their unlikeliness to cooperate. Meeting O'Hanrahan, Jackson asks why he's afraid of fighting, and he says he isn't. He just doesn't like to hurt people, because his mother warned him to be careful of others. He thinks the squad could do with more basic human niceness, but if the others were to hear it was his idea, Jackson would look bad. Talking to Raz about the reform, he says the squad needs a dose of angry juice. Jackson repeats this back, and he means psycho, saying he still has some hookups from his time with the fiends. Jackson turns and walks away. Lastly, he talks with Mags about the reassignment. She says it'd be easier to teach rad roaches because they need to work on their marksmanship and explosive skills. Jackson instructs them to enter the range and gives them some advice. Take positions to cover others and focus. Take time aiming and call out their targets. And exhale before firing without jerking the trigger. Following his advice, the Misfits land their shots. Mags says their shooting has improved, but they also need help with grenades. Jackson calls the squad back onto the range, and they pick up some dummy grenades. Jackson then gives them advice. He tells them to count, throw, and pull the pin in that order, throwing as quickly as a fastball and making sure to hit the target with the grenade. Thinking he did a good job, the Misfits throw their grenades all over the place. Oh my god. Leaving Camp Golf proud of himself, Jackson follows his map to the known location of Vault 34. There, he finds a mine shaft with a large amount of radioactive goo. He decides it's best not to enter. Finding a water treatment facility, Jackson enters the East Pump Station. Inside is a terminal with a significant data corruption. He repairs the network connection and loads up the warning message. Radiation is being detected in the water, but with no leaks to be found, it must be an external cause. Oh, wait, hold on, yeah. World map. How did I guess? Jackson comes across a large gated entrance, and passing through, he enters Freeside. On the east side of town, he walks into Mick and Ralph's, and talks to Ralph first. Jackson asks him about Freeside, and he tells him about the multiple businesses that make up the town. The King and his boys are spread out all over and control the water pump. The Van Graffs are the only energy weapon dealers and keep it that way, because Gloria Van Graff's men are all well armed, but the best is her brother, Jean-Baptiste Cutting. The Atomic Wrangler is the only place in Freeside to offer everything, and are good people. But they're also good at cleaning. Jackson then asks what he sells, and Ralph only makes deals with those the king accepts. Turning over to Mick, he says business was better when the Omertas were buying, and wants to know why they stopped buying his guns. Jackson says he'll listen out, and then asks if he has any special items. Mick freezes, and asks if he works for one of the casinos. Jackson can only answer yes. Mick then flatly says he doesn't sell Vegas banned items. Stepping out of the door, some thugs try to mug Jackson, but Boone is watching his backside. Walking the streets, he's waved over by a man in an alleyway. When Jackson approaches, the man runs further down in the alley and waves again. He follows the man and thinks to himself,
"This is a trap."
Walking further in, he takes note of another man in the alleyway following them, aiding in his suspicion. When Jackson reaches the first man, he's looking at a dead body between two dumpsters and asks if that was his friend. But he was just some idiot who entered an alleyway.
Sound familiar?
Jackson then discovers a bus that's been turned into a makeshift door and enters deep Freeside. Finding the King's school of impersonation, he sees men dressed as 50s greasers, and of them, he meets Pacer. Jackson asks to meet the King, and he says it's possible, but worth a price. Jackson says he doesn't have much money and turns away. Off in the distance, he can see the Strip's north gate is guarded by Securitrons, like Victor. When he approaches the entrance, Jackson is stopped by a man in a suit. Old Ben says he looks new and needs the advice. Don't pass the greeter without talking to it. The bots are programmed to vaporize all unauthorized entries. Jackson thanks Ben and asks for his story. He says he's been living in Freeside since he was born, and has done everything from being a courier to butcher to crier to escort to hired gun. Jackson says he was also a courier before getting shot, and Ben says it was the reason he left to join his father as a butcher. He ran a shop, but business dropped when another vendor appeared and sold mysterious meat at half price. After his father's passing, people began to develop tremors, and the only meat that can do that is human flesh. But the new vendor also died shortly after his father. The next tenant would later discover bodies hidden in the crawl spaces. With the money he earned, he bought a passport into Vegas, which he admits was cheaper than today, and got hired to advertise the talent outside the tops. But he was forced away when a manager framed him for stealing from the casino. A few grand went missing, and Ben was used as a scapegoat, stripped of his apartment and forced back into Freeside. Unable to find work, he turned to being an escort. Jackson asks if he means as an armed guard, and Ben says escort sounds better than saying man whore. He was paid for sex, and was good at it, but he quit once he felt dehumanized. With the escort money, he bought himself a pistol, and had the physicality to handle thugs. After saving some tourists, old Ben regained his reputation and retired a decade later. When the two part ways, Jackson sees a random thug run past the Securitron checkpoint and gets gunned down for it. As he approaches the checkpoint himself, the Securitron gatekeeper runs up to him saying he must submit to a credit check or present a passport before entering. Admission requires a passport or proof of the required minimum balance of 2,000 caps to prevent people of less repute from entering or from ruining a good time. Lacking both, Jackson leaves the checkpoint. Looking for a way to secure a passport, he tries to enter the Silver Rush. A Van Graff guard stops him at the front door and says he must search him to secure his weapons. Jackson permits him to, and the guard stows his weapons away until he leaves. Upon entering, Jackson overhears a conversation between a woman and a client. Gloria Van Graff says the client's payment is late, but the man wishes to renegotiate their deal. She says her shipment was already delivered and was tested prior to shipping, but he says the quality was subpar and expects a price adjustment. She turns to her brother Jean-Baptiste and says, "Do it." He turns and reduces a tied-up man into a pile of ash. Gloria then says she expects her money in the morning. Jackson walks up to her and asks about the town. She says the gun runners are her main competitors, and while she does respect them, she wants their business destroyed. Gloria and her brother operate here in New Vegas while the rest of her family is spread out. Asking about her, she was born into a big family and now avoids her parents, but they don't lack security as she doesn't sell cheap goods. Asking her about the Kings, she says they're just boys stuck in Neverland. But the King is different. When Gloria first moved into Freeside, they protested her establishment, but after some of them were turned to goo, both parties ceased fighting. When asked about the larger forces in Nevada, she says the NCR have been the Van Graff's enemies for decades, despite their larger size, and she only knows the rumors surrounding the Legion. Soldiers follow their lord with unquestioning obedience, but admits she would like to meet him. Jackson then asks if she has any work available, and Gloria says she needs a new bodyguard at the entrance. He accepts the offer, and she says the guard from before, Simon, will teach him. When Jackson steps outside, Simon begins to greet him, then becomes annoyed that he's the new hire. Simon tells him to just follow directions and cover the other side of the entrance. Jackson assumes his position, and Simon brings over a set of combat armor and asks if he'd prefer a plasma or laser rifle. Lasers have a high fire rate, but less damage, while plasmas are slow but powerful. Jackson chooses plasma, and Simon hands him a Van Graff plasma rifle. The job is to keep out riffraff and permit customers only after a pat-down, but he must never initiate a fight. He says they'll be paid in caps and with eye candy from the Atomic Wrangler. From the start, Jackson takes his job seriously. Halt! Halt! The first person to approach is a man slurring his words looking for a laser gun. Jackson turns him away and Simon commends him. The next person walks up, a well-dressed gambler looking to peruse their goods. Jackson tells him he must be searched first. The gambler agrees to the search and Simon allows him to enter. Another well-dressed gambler appears and Jackson tells him about the search. The gambler refuses and says his word should be enough, but Jackson denies him bluntly, and he says he'll spend his money elsewhere. Simon then makes a comment about Jackson's poor people skills. The fourth person to walk up is a gambler wearing a large military coat, asking to replace his revolver. Jackson tells him he must be searched, and he asks if it's necessary. Jackson states it's a company policy, and the gambler says he knew his plan wouldn't work, pulling out his gun. Jackson is able to kill him with the plasma rifle, and Simon says they need to remove the body because it's bad for business. Throwing his body into a nearby dumpster, Jackson finds a C4 explosive on his person and a revenge note detailing a suicide attack to kill the Van Graffs for his family. Returning to his post, the next person to walk over is Pacer, and he asks Simon if the boss lady is in. Simon recommends he enter to find out, but Pacer abstains and leaves them a message. He's always thinking of her. He wants Jackson to deliver it specifically, but when he asks why he won't do it himself, he said he'd be too distracting for her and walks away. Simon commends Jackson for remaining professional and says his shift is over. He hands over the armor and plasma rifle and reports back to Gloria. She says he did an okay job, but did dock his pay for mishandling the third person, handing him 200 caps. She then says she replaced him with someone more experienced, but has another job he can take for more money. Jackson agrees, and she says she has an ongoing deal with a buyer who wants a sample. They've required a package to be delivered to a discreet location the client chose, and Jackson embraces his courier past. Gloria gives the package and shows him the location. She recommends completing it quickly because there's likely to be a high payout for her and Jackson. Jackson looks for the agreed meeting spot and sees a strange man in the middle of nowhere. He asks if Jackson is the Van Graff's courier, and Jackson confirms he is. He asks if Jackson has the package, and Jackson confirms he does. He says their business has concluded and will contact Jackson's superiors. Then, Jackson leaves. No questions asked. He reports back to Gloria, telling her about the future contact. She pays Jackson 200 more caps and says Jean-Baptiste has a job for him now. Finding her brother, he says while his sister is impressed with Jackson, he is not, but he's willing to give him a chance. Jackson asks him about the job description, but Jean-Baptiste denies him and says he must agree to it blindly. In need of more money, Jackson agrees to the job. He says Gloria made a deal, and Jackson must tie up a loose end by finding a girl. Asking for her name, he says Rose of Sharon Cassidy is her real name. He wants Jackson to bring her in for a one-on-one talk, but when he asks what for, Jean-Baptiste says if he says anything but yes, he'll be cut off. Jackson asks if he knows of her location, and he says they wouldn't need his help if they did, but recommends talking with Alice McLafferty at the Crimson Caravan. She keeps tabs on caravan traffic, including that of the Cassidy caravans. He says there's good money waiting for him, if he completes the job. Jackson makes his way to the Crimson Caravan Company and enters the main office. Inside, he meets Alice McLafferty and asks for Cass on the Van Graff's behalf, but she says she is too. She's most likely at the Mojave outpost, so Jackson begins his 3-day trek over. He enters the outpost barracks and meets a woman sitting at the bar. Cass tells him to buzz off if he isn't buying her a drink, and Jackson asks if she's okay. She says she's drinking to forget, but with each drink she's only getting angrier, and it hasn't changed from her time out in the West. She used to run a caravan, but stopped when her cargo and driver were burnt. She suspects the Legion were behind it and are cutting off the NCR supply line, but her boss, Jackson, won't let her leave anyway. Jackson then asks her about the other Jackson, and she says he runs the outpost and is denying her travel north because of her caravan papers. Jackson then brings up Jean-Baptiste, and she asks who he is. He tells Cass that he's part of the Van Graffs, but she only knows of the ones out west, or Gloria. She's not opposed to meeting with him, but she won't leave until her papers are cleared and suggests he work with the Crimson Caravan if he's strapped for cash. 3 days later, he walks back to the caravan office and asks Alice if she has any work available. She says there aren't any openings for caravanners, but does need a runner. Again, Jackson embraces his past, but this time he has to deliver an invoice to Dr. Hildern inside Camp McCarran.
Where are you? World map.
I need to get inside. That's the whole point of me doing this! Jackson then turns to the Atomic Wrangler and asks Francine Garrett what they offer. She says liquor, chems, whores, and gambling, but all must be paid for beforehand. He asks if she has any work available, and she does. Before they enforced the paying up front rule, they allowed tabs, and some customers ditched. She needs Jackson to be a debt collector, and offers to pay him a percentage of the collected tabs. Jackson asks how many caps, and she says he can earn 25% of the full total, equating to 150 caps. Jackson settles the deal and accepts the job. Francine tells him about his 3 targets. Grex is in Freeside and owes 138 caps. While he is harmless, she warns him not to mention his lazy eye. Santiago, also in Freeside, owes 212 caps, is suave, but a pansy. And Lady Jane owes 250 caps and is haughty, but is just an NCR prospector. Her whereabouts are unknown, but locals might know. She runs goods for the followers. Ironically, Lady Jane is who Jackson finds first, sitting outside the strip checkpoint with old Ben. He tells her he was sent by the Garretts. She apologizes and says she can't pay in full, but would if her caravan would be recovered from a cave. Jackson, with the perception of a hawk, notices her tell, so she gives up 250 caps even though she won't have enough to return home. Next, he finds Grex, a sharply dressed ghoul begging on the street. He asks Jackson to donate some caps, but he asks if he's collecting to pay off his debt. He panics and says he already does, and gives Jackson 138 caps. Lastly, he finds Santiago sheltering in a broken building. Jackson says he owes the Garretts, but he says he doesn't owe anyone anything because he's a VIP. Jackson tells him that he was told about his silver tongue, and he calls himself a poet and debt-free. Jackson then threatens his life, and Santiago says he can explain the story, but Jackson just demands the payment again. Santiago becomes offended at his attitude, and Jackson punches him in the face. Wincing, he coughs up 212 caps and begs for his life. Jackson thanks him and leaves. Still, with all of the money in his pockets, Jackson makes a beeline for the strip checkpoint and submits to the credit check. The Securitron allows Jackson to enter, now having more than 2,000 caps. Walking into the vibrant lights of New Vegas, Jackson is greeted by Victor and tells him he was sent by the head of New Vegas, Mr. House, to bring him to the Lucky 38. Following Victor to the building shaped like a roulette spinner, when they reach the entrance, he says Jackson's friend Boone must wait outside. Entering the Lucky 38 casino, Victor directs him to the penthouse via elevator, and when he steps out, he sees a Securitron with a woman's face. Jane calls Jackson Sugar and says Mr. House is in his office. Asking who she is, Jane describes herself as one of Mr. House's girls to keep him entertained, because he's the reason for the wonderland of New Vegas. Jackson calls her smitten with love, and she says it's because he's the best man for reclaiming the city from the tribes using his Securitrons. He notes her feelings for humans, and she says her outside is robotic, but inside, she is an exact neurocopy of Mr. House's favorite girl. Understanding what she means, Jackson knows she's a copy of a dead woman, and asks what purpose she serves. But a lady doesn't kiss and tell.
I'm concerned with this question that pops in my head. What would I see if I had a black light on me right now?
Asking about New Vegas, she says it has the 3 families casinos and other local attractions. The families are groups of tribals with new money. She calls the Omertas brutes, but the chairman in white gloves at least pretend to have class. They run 3 of the 4 remaining casinos, the Tops, the Ultra Lukes, and Gomorrah. But the Lucky 38 isn't open to the public. The other attractions include the NCR Embassy, the Vault 21 Hotel and Gift Shop, and Michelangelo's sign shop. Walking around the penthouse, Jackson finds it to be completely empty, until he sees a large monitor with a new man's face on it. With this meeting, he has established connection with Mr. House. He says he's been waiting a long time to meet Jackson, and asks his opinion on the destination. But he asks the screen what Mr. House even is, and he calls Jackson crude, repeating his question. Vegas has always been one of a kind, but the Strip is only a glimpse of its former glory. But he saved it. Jackson asks him why a courier is being treated like a VIP, and he says Jackson has been playing a game ever since Victor saved him. He demands for business to resume, and Mr. House says one of his employees has stolen from him and wants it back. Jackson is free to deal with Benny in any way for the platinum chip, and once it's delivered, he'll receive quadruple the contract fee. Jackson wants his questions answered, but Mr. House asks which. Regarding Benny, he has led the chairman since Mr. House recruited his tribe and planned to make him his protege. He requires a human agent to perform specific tasks, but miscalculated Benny's drive, and he now sees Jackson is fit to replace him. Mr. House believes Benny found out about the platinum chip and planned to use it himself, but it's too complex for a tribal. Jackson then asks why he didn't intervene sooner, and he blames both Victor and Goodsprings for being too far away to thwart Benny. It's not going to be any easier because Benny always has his bodyguards around, except when he's in his private room in the tops. Jackson then asks why he doesn't order the chairmen to do anything, and he says they share a tribal affinity, but Swank, his chief commander, can be swayed with the evidence of Benny's crimes.
You mean like a bullet wound? I just pushed back some hair.
Mr. House can't do it because Securitrons can't enter casinos unless they're invited, and his cover will be blown if Benny sees one inside. And he also won't have them arrest Benny because it would be bad for business, and Benny might just destroy the chip instead. The only advantage is Benny doesn't know Mr. House knows Benny has the chip. He says sneaking in can work, but it'd be difficult. So Jackson suggests a diplomatic approach, and he says to meet him in public. This would force Benny to move them into a private area to avoid exposure. Jackson then asks about the platinum chip, and he says it's a special item lost long ago, and that's all he'll tell him until he can re-deliver it. Jackson asks why he only used a single courier for something so important, and House explains that Jackson wasn't alone. The other couriers were used as dummies, and thousands of caps were spent to protect him. If he'd used a caravan, it would have been too obvious, and says it's ironic at how close it was. Jackson then demands to know more, but House refuses. He says only he will know its purpose, because he designed and paid exuberantly for it. Jackson asks for his real identity, and he says he is Robert Edwin House, president of the New Vegas Strip, and oversaw its renovations in 2274. When he discovered NCR activity at the Hoover Dam, he recruited tribal forces to aid his Securitrons in rebuilding it before the NCR arrived. A treaty was signed, and money followed. Before that, he was the CEO of Robco up until the Great War of 2077. Jackson then points at the computer and says he isn't a man, but House says he is still flesh and blood, and he remains alive through financial means alone. Jackson tries to ask about the factions of New Vegas, but House withholds any further answers. Jackson, without leverage, accepts to work for 1,000 caps. Before he leaves the penthouse, Victor stops him and says Mr. House is providing Jackson with the High Roller Suite, and all of his friends are welcome to enter too, but only he is allowed to meet with Mr. House. Stepping outside of the Lucky 38, Jackson is approached by an NCR trooper who has a message from Ambassador Crocker. He hands him the note and walks away. Reading through it, Crocker wants to meet with Jackson at the NCR embassy in the Strip and will pardon all previous crimes committed against the NCR. Jackson, walking the Strip, hears a busker on the street telling jokes. Billy Knight gets upset when Jackson ruins his show, but he agrees to answering his questions. Asking about his past, he rips jokes about his childhood. Hearing his jokes, Jackson says that he can help him look for work, and he says he'll need something as good as his lifelong comedy career. Jackson then points out that he's living on the street, and Billy says, "That was the joke." Jackson then enters the Tops Casino, and a chairman greeter stops him at the door. He welcomes him in, but says he must hand over any weapons he has. Jackson does as he's told, but secretly keeps a concealed weapon on his person. The greeter says they'll be kept in the bank with the money upstairs, and he'll receive them upon leaving. Walking onto the gambling floor, in the distance, Jackson sees a checkered suit. When he walks up to him, Benny is left aghast, but calms himself down and asks if Jackson was the person who entered the Lucky 38. Ignoring his question, Jackson coldly tells him he needs to work on his marksmanship. He says he hit his target, but can rest easier knowing he's alive. Then Benny invites him away to a private location to answer his questions, but Jackson wants to talk in the open. He says he won't talk in his own establishment, and Jackson demands him to talk about the platinum chip. Benny says he can't because the case involved is too complex to discuss publicly. Eventually, Jackson gives in, but warns him about being punctual. He says he also wants to talk about their future, and gives him the presidential suite key. Using the key to unlock an elevator, Jackson enters the suite and finds a safe on the wall. Picking the lock, he finds a large sum of caps, a grenade rifle, and a power fist. Jackson then waits around patiently, until he thinks too much time has passed. Just as he reaches for the doorknob, he hears Benny's voice come over the intercom. He says he isn't coming because he's not stupid and is skipping town. Jackson demands his questions get answered, and he says they better be worth it. He asks about the platinum chip, and Benny says it's Mr. House's key, but there's even more to the story. He's in the game now, and he's playing to win, and Jackson calls him a cheater. Benny says he's just being outplayed, not cheated. Jackson then calls him a dead man, and he says that's exactly why he's using the intercom. Jackson then hears the elevators ding, and Benny tells him to stay dead this time. As the doors open, 4 bodyguards walk out with guns drawn and begin firing. Boone runs to grab a pool cue, and Jackson whips out his hidden spiked knuckles. Together, the two of them kill the guards and find Benny's suite key on one of the guards' bodies. Taking the elevator to the 13th floor, Jackson enters Benny's room and finds a hidden door in the back of the room. Opening it, he sees a Securitron with a dopey smile, and Jackson meets Yes Man. He asks how he can help him, and Jackson asks what he's doing. He's monitoring Mr. House and decrypting his messages. Jackson then asks about his name, and he says Benny called him that after being programmed to help. Jackson asks if he knows about the platinum chip, and he says it's a very advanced data storage device, and guesses it's an upgrade for Mr. House's defenses. It can only be read on special hardware found in only 2 locations, the Lucky 38 and an underground facility at Fortification Hill. Asking about Benny, Yes Man says he plans to kill Mr. House and plant him into the mainframe to control the Securitrons instead. Jackson calls him trusting, and Yes Man says he was programmed to help everyone. Jackson then asks if he wanted to rule instead, and he says he'd help him because he can't say no. He recommends meeting with the Regent's tribes, and once the Legion attacks Hoover Dam, he can enact the plan. Jackson then asks how he'd remove Mr. House, but Yes Man doesn't know because he's never been in the Lucky 38. But he does know Mr. House is inside it. Jackson tells him he can enter it, and Yes Man says he's free to murder him whenever he wants, and just needs the platinum chip Benny killed a courier for. Jackson then asks if he knows anything about the courier, and he says he knew where he was, and Benny left for him, while Yes Man stayed behind to decrypt more messages. In them, Mr. House spent more than 800,000 caps in just the last year to find the chip. 7 couriers were hired, and 6 were just carrying junk. Jackson then tells him the truth about being the courier, and Yes Man says it can't be true because Jackson's alive. He insists, but Yes Man says his joke isn't funny because he feels bad about setting up the murder. Jackson then asks where Benny ran off to, and he says he saw him take a secret escape elevator to Fortification Hill to use the platinum chip, but Caesar's Legion is located on top of it. Jackson then asks what he should do after he gets the chip. He should take it to Mr. House and feign compliance first, and then kill him, but only after considering giving him the chip, because he's the only person who knows how to use it, but unlocking more upgrades will make it harder to kill him. Once that's completed, Yes Man can install himself onto the mainframe. Jackson asks if he actually recommends talking to the tribes for support, and he says it's unnecessary, because the Securitrons are enough, but he recommended it earlier to judge their right to exist in the future. The tribes include the 3 families on the Strip, the Chairmen, Omertas, and White Gloves, and other important groups outside, the Boomers, Great Khans, and the Brotherhood of Steel. The Boomers fire artillery at anyone who approaches their settlement at the Nellis Air Force Base, but Yes Man hypothesizes recruiting their cannons could be beneficial. The Khans are like beaten animals because their tribe was kicked out of Vegas by the 3 families and later settled in Red Rock Canyon just to be beaten again by the NCR. He explains that Benny was suspicious of the Omertas, but did pay a receptionist at Gamora's once, and he didn't like the White Gloves at all, but they're nice people. He then says the Brotherhood's armor and weaponry would be useful, but they're obsessive over technology, so they probably won't accept robot policing. Jackson then asks how Benny reprogrammed Yes Man by himself, and he says he got some help from a lady in a fort in Freeside. Before leaving, Jackson makes a stop at the Aces Theater and meets Tommy Torini. He says the theater was his and the Rad Pack boys' idea and presented it to Benny and now runs it all himself. He says Benny knows how to run a business, but that's whenever he's available. He then doesn't tell Jackson about Benny going on benders and having a Gamora girl hidden away in his suite. Jackson asks what Tommy's role is, and he says he's the talent manager, showrunner, and headlining act. The number of acts are low right now, but the Rad Pack Review perform every night, all with songs, dancing, and jokes. Jackson says he has a couple of people in mind, and Tommy says if he finds any, he'll give him a 3% cut, handing him 4 business cards. Leaving the Tops Casino, Jackson is stopped by a well-dressed man, and recognizes him as Volpe's Inculta. Caesar is watching and is forgiving all his past transgressions, but will only bestow his mark once. He wants to meet Jackson at Fortification Hill, and Volpe says Benny is likely to be there too. Jackson asks how he found him, and he says this isn't his first time in the Strip, because he's the Legion's greatest frumentari. Jackson asks what Caesar wants to discuss, and Volpe says he'll understand later. He says Jackson must travel to Cottonwood Cove, south of Nelson, to meet with Cursor Lucullus. Jackson then walks out of the Strip into Freeside and enters the Atomic Wrangler to return the debts he collected. He hands over 600 caps, and she pays him 150 back, and offers him another person to hunt down. McCaffrey stole some caps and fled into Vegas after he found out Jackson took his job. She wants him killed and the money brought back. Jackson says he'll deal with him, but she wants his hat back as proof of the kill. He re-enters the Strip, meets with Caleb McCaffrey, and he knows Jackson was sent by the Garretts. Jackson demands to split the caps and he give up his hat, but McCaffrey says he's been killing before Jackson was born. Sure. Jackson says he only needs his hat as proof of a kill, and he sees it as a bargain because he can always buy a new hat, but did want to have some fun fighting. He hands Jackson his hat and drops 57 caps inside it. Reporting back to Francine, Jackson hands over McCaffrey's hat, and she says no one gets away screwing over the Garretts, and plans on hanging it up on a wall. She then pays him 150 caps and offers up a room for him. It's free now, because it used to be McCaffrey's. On his way to Cottonwood Cove, Jackson discovers a farm that's been damaged and a burned-down house. Searching the rubble, he finds a torn diary page next to a small burnt corpse. Reading the page, it's a diary entry about the farm animals trying to eat the author, like their dead parents wanted to as well. She plans to burn down the house to thwart the animals' plans. Jackson then finds another page next to an empty suitcase in the back of a truck. The author left the animals to look for her parents, but when she found them, they were feral ghouls, and they attacked her. Jackson then sees pens of malnourished Brahmin, bighorners, and their calves. Continuing down the road, he sees a posted sign with a radiation trefoil. As he walks past the sign, he feels his skin begin to tingle and backs away. Walking along the town perimeter to reduce his exposure, Jackson can see a thick radiation fog covering the town of Searchlight. As he crests the hill to see Cottonwood Cove, Boone stops him to talk. He says he's been to this specific Legion slave camp before and will kill any legionary on sight, so if he wishes to proceed, he'll need to do it without him. Jackson agrees it's best to part for the time being, and Boone threatens if he makes any friends, he'll cut him off before walking away.
It just dawned on me now, Boone has all of my healing items.
Not trusting the Legion, Jackson walks back to the 188 to talk with...
Hey, Veronica. Yeah, I thought your energy was really cute.
Didn't get enough of talking to me the first time, huh?
Yep.
Before she joins him, though, she says he should know an important detail. The reason she asked his opinion about the Brotherhood of Steel before is because she is one, and asks if he accepts her. Jackson is comforted by the fact that she has received training instead, and Veronica says she's gifted at punching people, pulling out her own power fist. Jackson and Veronica return to Cottonwood Cove and walk down the trail to find crucified bodies, barely alive. He talks with one of them named Anders, and he begs for help. He says the Legion does this to punish drug runners, so Jackson asks if he was smuggling, but he just begs to be freed instead. That's when a Legion explorer interrupts them and demands to know why Jackson is there. Showing him the mark of Caesar, Jackson says he was invited. He permits him to enter, but warns he'll join Anders for any aggression. Jackson meets Aurelius of Phoenix, who's overseeing Cottonwood. He calls Jackson a profligate and says Lucullus is waiting for him at the docks to sail to the fort. Jackson asks if they see much action in the most southeastern part of Nevada, and he says they haven't been attacked, but have done it themselves. Jackson then commends his armor, and he explains he earned the armor of a centurion after he was ordered by Caesar to set up the camp when Wolpace forced the NCR out of Searchlight. Meeting Lucullus at the dock, he says Jackson will meet with Caesar, an honor only he of the Dissolute has ever received. Jackson asks who a Dissolute is, and he says they're any non-legionnaire who lacks morals, only beaten by the profligates who claim to be civilized but are corrupt instead. Jackson asks why he received the honor, and he says he should know why, but says he must be particularly remarkable. Jackson readies himself, and as he boards the boat, Lucullus says the trip will take a few hours. On the fort's dock, the main gate guard states he must relinquish all banned items, and Jackson does as he's told, sneakily keeping some of them hidden away. As Jackson hikes up the hill, he sees more crucified bodies, women forced to work as slaves, and young boys in armor running around playing. At the top of the hill, Jackson goes to enter the main tent, but the Praetorian guard stops him, saying he must enter alone. Jackson tells Veronica to wait outside, and she says that she should have brought a book. He opens the tent flap and walks into the foyer, seeing a white-haired man sitting on a throne, and when he turns to his right, he sees...
Well, how do you do?
Jackson talks to Caesar face to face, and he praises him for earning all of his accolades in such a short time. He has ears everywhere to avoid being deaf, but Jackson hasn't really been keeping silent. He plans to assault the dam and invade the west, but wants Jackson to remove Mr. House first. On the hillside is an old building where the fort was established in 2277. Inside the building is a hatch leading to two steel doors with the insignia of the Lucky 38. Caesar says it matches the sigil on the platinum chip Benny was carrying and is the same size as the slot on the console to open up the hatch, and he hypothesizes the chip will also open the impenetrable doors. He wants Jackson to destroy everything inside and report back. Holding out the platinum chip and access codes, he says if Jackson accepts his request, he'll permit him to talk with Benny. Benny tells him to laugh, but Jackson says he'll laugh after completing business, holding the chip up to his face. Benny says that he shouldn't destroy it because it's the key to Vegas, and Jackson should do what House wants, but return to Yes Man after. Staring at his enemy left helpless, Jackson asks about his past, and he obliges. He says the chairmen were a group of renegades called the Boot Riders, but after House gave them the tops, he gave them suits and called them the chairmen. Benny was the head of the family for 7 years after Mr. House introduced himself to the previous Chief Bingo, who refused to join him, and lost to Benny when he challenged him for the position. When they first saw a Securitron, they destroyed it immediately, but 20 more showed up the very next day, saying Vegas needed them to help defend it in exchange for food and shelter. Jackson then skips ahead and asks what he did after he left him in the tops. Using some stealth boys to stow away on the Legion boat, Benny disguised himself using a dead Legionary's uniform from Nelson and tried to sneak into the bunker, but was caught. Jackson then asks for his opinions on the factions of Vegas, and he starts with Mr. House. He says he shouldn't be in rule just because he thinks it belongs to him after sheltering for 1,000 years. Then he talks about the families. The chairmen are blue, the Omertas degenerates, and the white gloves are creepy, but all of them will follow Jackson if convinced. Benny then says Jackson is the best option to take control if he can use Yes Man, because the NCR is just the Legion, but legal, and the Legion are twisted.
Nah, just spruce it up with a crucifixion here and there. Come closer so I can step on you.
Jackson walks out of the tent and picks up Veronica to enter the weather monitoring station. The station guard tells him to be worth Kaiser's trust, handing over Jackson's weapons. He finds a console near some metal trapdoors humming with power and can see a round slot. Inserting the chip into the slot, the trapdoors open up to a staircase leading to 2 elevator doors with the number 38 on them. He walks through the door into the Securitron vault, and Jackson can feel his skin tingle with radiation, and on the monitor, Mr. House is waiting for him. He says Jackson is ahead of schedule, but is glad he is after Caesar gave him the chip. He suspects Caesar wants the bunker's contents destroyed, but knows Jackson will work for him instead. House tells him to upload the chip's data to the primary computer at the other end of the facility, but this is as far as he can go. He can broadcast himself, but he's unable to interact with the security systems and other bots, but knows there is a security room he can use to deactivate them. As the two part, House hopes Jackson will do the right thing, because the rewards and punishments will be large. Jackson and Veronica run through the facility to reduce their exposure to the radiation, and finding the first robot, she shows off her skills. Jackson comes across the security room with 3 terminals. The first does nothing. The second he's able to hack, and the third is too advanced for him. So he hacks Terminal 2, and the only command available is Cancel Security Alert. When he clicks on it, the turrets revert to standby mode, and they continue to run through the facility, destroying the bots along the way. Then he finds the power regulator, but he knows if they're destroyed, the core will overload in seconds and result in a catastrophe. Entering the computer control room, Jackson looks through a window and sees...
Whoa. Okay.
Activating the Securitron operation console, it says software updates can be installed. He inserts the Platinum chip and installs the Mark II upgrade. Through the window, he can see and hear the machines come alive as the Securitron army. He runs back to report back to Mr. House, and he says Jackson can return to the Lucky 38 to discuss the next steps toward mankind's bright future. But when Jackson steps out, the guard confiscates his belongings again, so he has to report back to Kaiser. He says he felt the ground shake and wants to reward Jackson for completing the job. He gets to decide Benny's death. He was planning to order his Praetorians to execute him, unless Jackson wanted to do it himself, handing him a machete. He thanks Kaiser, but walks over to Benny without it. He asks what Jackson saw, and he tells Benny about the upgraded Securitron army. He laughs to himself and says he'd have loved to see Caesar's face when they emerge. He then tells Jackson to meet with Yes Man and turn Vegas into a town he'd be proud of. Holding the barrel of his concealed shotgun to Benny's forehead, Jackson can't miss. Tugging on the trigger, he gives Benny some parting words.
Like you said, the game was rigged from the start.
Kaiser says Jackson must be pleased with himself and wants to resume business. He wants Mr. House removed and is letting Jackson decide his fate too, and for helping him, allows him to ask questions. Jackson points to the machine behind him and asks about its purpose. Kaiser says it's an auto dock and it treats ailments of those he deems worthy to use. It's a powerful tool of his due to the medical ignorance of the Legion. Next, Jackson asks about Wolpace, and Kaiser says he was a boy from a tribe south of Utah and he trained to the rank of Decanus, but later broke rank when he led his platoon in battle to capture a chieftain. When he was set to be crucified, Kaiser made him a Frumentari. Wolpace does everything, while being able to infiltrate and imitate the enemy. Jackson then asks how he rose to power, and he says he was born a profligate of the NCR. At age 2, his father was killed and his mother became a follower of the apocalypse as a librarian, and is the reason he learned to read. He was raised under the followers' tutelage to spread knowledge, but at the age of 20, he was sent on his first expedition as an anthropologist and linguist. Along with Calhoun, the physician, he studied tribal dialects of the Grand Canyon, but he calls it all a waste of time. Making smart people learn the languages of lesser savages is idiotic. He met with the Mormon missionary Joshua Graham, who knew some of the dialects already, but as they traded knowledge, they were captured by the Blackfoot tribe for ransom. They were at war with 7 other tribes and losing fast, and he went against Calhoun's ideals. He taught the Blackfoot how to use guns and make explosives from the books he had read. Then he led them to fight the weakest enemy tribe, the Ridgers. But when they refused to surrender, he ordered for everyone to be killed. From there, he continued to conquer the next village, and when they also refused, he forced them to see the Ridgers' corpses and showed them the horrors of true warfare. All of the remaining tribes would later join him, and he planned to erase all tribal identities under his new name, Kaiser, and form a single tribe, the Legion. He would then send Calhoun with a message for the followers to not interfere, and Joshua Graham, the interpreter, became his first legatus. He's been conquering more tribes for decades, gaining more people and power across Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and now sees Vegas as his Rome. After learning the paths of the Legion, Jackson leaves Caesar in Fortification Hill and makes his way back to the tops.
Oh, yes, man. What? Uh-oh.
Stepping out of the casino, he finds Yes Men rolling around outside, and Jackson asks if he can complete Penny's plan. He says it can be done easily if the chip can reset admin privileges, and Jackson says he'll return if something happens to Mr. House. With the platinum chip in hand, Jackson returns to Mr. House's monitor and demands his questions be answered. House says that he'd be happy to, once he receives the chip. Jackson then demands a discussion of pay, but House says they already agreed to the terms before, and if Jackson continues, he will deem his actions as blackmail. Jackson then repeats his demand for his questions to be answered, and House refuses, demanding he give up the chip. Jackson refuses, and House says it's not negotiable, advising him to think clearly, because he's surrounded by Securitron guards. Jackson remains calm, saying if he were attacked, the chip could be destroyed. Agitated, House says at 30 he had earned enough money to run an entire empire, and won't let Jackson ransom off his own property after spending 2 centuries searching for his invention. He tells Jackson to be a good courier and do his job. Clutching the platinum chip closer, Jackson says he isn't afraid. Securitrons encircle Jackson and begin firing at him, but using electro-pulse grenades, he disrupts their signal, rendering them useless. Finding a terminal, he unlocks the control room elevator and takes it to a narrow metal walkway leading to a cryogenic sleep chamber. Jackson interacts with the nearby terminal and clicks Unseal LS Chamber. A warning appears, stating the risk of a microbial infection, and Jackson continues. The chamber opens its door and awakens its occupant, Mr. House, an incredibly frail old man with every life function attached to the machine. Jackson greets him, and in labored breaths, House asks why he's undoing centuries of work. Jackson says he doesn't like him, and House calls him stupid for ruining mankind's future over some feelings. He won't be able to control anything, but Jackson will allow him to live. However, he begs to be killed instead. Jackson turns back to the terminal and disables Mr. House's cerebral interface. He looks up from the monitor to see Mr. House alone, forever. An obituary for Mr. House is mass distributed to all Pit Boys, and Jackson reads through it. At age 261, House has died, and mankind is doomed after losing his knowledge of increasing longevity and amazing abilities. No one will likely ever be as incredible. Orphaned young, he later attended the Institute of Massachusetts and founded Robco at age 22. When the Great War started, he protected Las Vegas by defeating the bombs and would later recruit the 3 families, form the Treaty of New Vegas, and rebuild the Strip in hopes to help humanity. But it won't, because he's gone. At the end, there's a reminder House wrote to himself to fix it up before the illiterates could read it. Jackson then returns to Yes Man and welcomes him into the Lucky 38. Inside the penthouse, Yes Man takes the chip and uploads himself to the mainframe. He commends Mr. House's databank, and searching through it, he finds information on the platinum chip. He wants to show Jackson a demonstration House had prepared for him in the basement. Jackson finds himself in a large metal arena and walks onto the observation deck. Below, Yes Man shows off the weaponry of the Securitrons, then installs the Mark II OS to upgrade all of the Securitrons. Jackson watches in horror as he realizes the mistakes he's made.
Altogether, this software upgrade confers a 235% increase in combat effectiveness per unit. New Vegas finally has soldiers worthy of protecting it. I hope you enjoyed this demonstration. You can come back up and see me or be on your way. I know you're a busy person.
What have I done?
After talking more with Yes Man, Jackson takes some time to think things over and decides to take a walk to clear his head.
The game crashed. Uh-oh. You're joking, right? How do I find myself in these predicaments all the time?
Ooh, got something good for me?
Kind
Is
of.
it a dress?
If I find one, yes. I am so easily persuaded.
Inside the Atomic Wrangler, Jackson gets to talking with a sharp-dressed ghoul named Hadrian. He asks why Jackson is so ugly, and he's taken aback. Hadrian apologizes, thinking he was just a heckler the Garretts hired to spice up his show. He says he performs stand-up and has a nice contract with the Garretts, but when Jackson asks him about the pay, he says it's not much, and he's actually just under a contract he can't get out of. Jackson then tells him about Tommy Torini's show, and he says he'd like to do it, except the Garretts won't let him leave. Speaking with James Garrett, Jackson asks about freeing Hadrian because he isn't a good look for them. James agrees with Jackson, and he says he's cutting him loose to find someone else.
Hey, yo, Hadrian. Let's talk.
Any luck with Garrett yet?
Jackson hands him a business card, and Hadrian walks out. Then, Jackson does the same with Billy Knight, the Lonesome Drifter, and Bruce Isaac, who only agreed because the strip has good security. Reporting back to Tommy Torini, he says the cowboy has chops and puts 100 caps in Jackson's palm. He adds another 150 caps and says Isaac is bringing in a lot of money. Another 125 caps and says the ugly one is a novelty. And then he says the street comedian practically begged to be let in, and tops it off with 45 more caps. Stepping outside, Jackson meets Walter Phoebus, who says it's too hot to talk long. But Jackson notices something's wrong. He needs to settle a score with Heck Gunderson for stealing his land. Walter calls him a snake for being the biggest landowner of stolen land and using his money to buy NCR senators. He sends his men to threaten homeowners and offers pennies for their land to be left alone. He wants to make Heck suffer, and Jackson says he might help. Walter then says Heck is inside the Ultra Lukes. Turning to his wife, Ethel Phoebus, she says Jackson can help her by persuading her husband to leave town. Calmly. Walking into the Ultra Lukes, Jackson is greeted at the door by a white glove telling him to turn his weapons in. He agrees to, but keeps his smaller weapons concealed.
Adieu.
Gesundheit. Yeah. Why is this guy able to tout his gun then? Excuse me.
You watch yourself around Mr. Gunderson.
Why the... Eat shit.
Jackson meets a distraught man at the bar, and it's Heck Gunderson. He asks if Jackson has seen a young man with brown hair and a white hat. He lies and jokes about seeing him in a bikini too. Heck says it's not funny to make fun of a worried parent because he hasn't seen his son in hours, and Jackson apologizes. He explains that he's one of the largest ranchers east of California, and his bodyguard gets to keep his gun because he made a deal to make future deals with the White Gloves. They control the food supply in Vegas, and Heck has some to offer them. But when he left to talk with them for just a minute, his son Ted disappeared. He has his men searching while he waits here, hoping his son would find him instead. Jackson then asks about the White Gloves, and he says they wear masks, but the ones who handle the business deals don't. Heck says he'll give Jackson a lot of money if he can return his son safely, and will get even more for the names of those responsible. Reporting back to Walter, Jackson says Heck calls himself an honest rancher, and Walter says he was born a viper. Telling him about Heck's missing son, he says he wants him to suffer even more. But Jackson agrees with Ethel, telling him his vengeance will only bring about more innocent deaths. Walter says death already exists, and Heck is the reason for it. Unable to convince him, Jackson walks away. Finding an unmasked concierge, Mortimer says the white gloves were made public only recently, but have been established for generations, working hard to be a refined people. Jackson then asks if he has any work available, and he says he does, but not for someone like him. Entering the Gourmand, he meets an unmasked woman named Marjorie and asks if she's an employee. She sees herself as a caretaker more than a laborer, as she is the Lux's founder. Jackson says he's looking for a missing person, and she sighs, "Again?" Marjorie then says it was settled before with an investigator and continues to talk about their bad reputation they received, trying to affirm the White Glove Society has never eaten human flesh.
I knew none of this.
She says the investigator came last week after a bride-to-be disappeared, and Jackson asks to speak with him. To her knowledge, he hasn't checked out, and Mortimer gave him a room to prove the Society's courtesy. Jackson then tells her about the new disappearance, and she says that she'll talk to the staff to reassure guests of their safety. Asking about them eating flesh, she says it was a dark time before they became the Society, but it's behind them. Jackson then lies and says she can trust a fellow cannibal, only to be met with Marjorie threatening to throw him out if he ever says it again. Asking about Heck, she says they met over his livestock, but refused to buy because it would provide them with a surplus of food, which wouldn't keep their chef Felipe's delicacy a staple of their high-caliber status. Returning to Mortimer, Jackson asks about the investigator's room, and lies about having helpful information for him. He says he wouldn't normally give client information, but tells him he hasn't checked out yet, and hands him a spare room key. Jackson then asks him about the rumor he heard about cannibalism. Mortimer calls it a nasty lie, but when Jackson lies about craving for it himself, he drops his formalities and says he's planning a dinner, but has a problem with the main course's temperamental father. Jackson asks if the main course is a person, and he says it's the wrong person. They originally scouted an heir to an empire who left his estate, and one unlikely to be missed. But when the Gloves tried to trap him, he escaped and saw their faces. They ordered for a replacement, and the Gloves hurriedly stole the son of the most dangerous Brahmin baron in the hotel. While they're no longer allowed to consume flesh, he hopes with this to convince Marjorie. He needs a healthy, well-bred replacement, and the other boy removed. But with such a short window, it would need to be the original target, Carlisle St. Clair, and he needs to be kept alive for freshness. Mortimer says he lives in a shack north of Vegas. He says Jackson can convince him to walk in, or just knock him out, as he holds up a cattle prod. Asking about the other boy, he hopes to convince Ted Gunderson it was just a misunderstanding, but if he can't, he needs to be slaughtered and served, rendering the need for the replacement null. But if he is eaten, they'll also need to deal with the father. He suggests smearing Ted's blood around his father's room to frame him. Jackson then lies and says he'll help out, asking where Ted is located. Mortimer tells him that he's being held in the kitchen beneath the Gourmand, giving him the keys to the kitchen and freezer, and also gives him another key, but warns that the father has security around the penthouse. Jackson finds the investigator's room and unlocks the door with a key. Opening the door, he sees the room's been ransacked, and a body is dead on the floor. When he turns around, he sees two Gloves beating Veronica with canes, knocking her unconscious. Jackson uses his silenced pistol and spiked knuckles to kill them silently. He then checks the investigator's body and thinks Crusoe should have been in Miami instead. Searching his body, he finds a matchbook with writing on its back that reads, "Steam Room, 4 p.m. Re-entering the Gourmand, Jackson unlocks the door to the kitchen, but is stopped by a Glove. He lies that Mortimer ordered for him to move the kid, fearing someone might betray them. The Glove lets him through, calling Mortimer annoyingly flippant. Making his way to the main kitchen, Jackson meets Felipe, who tells him to get back to work. Jackson is appalled at his ego, only for him to call himself the god of New Vegas Brahmin fusion cuisine, who invented edible food. Felipe says his lack of dignity is that of a server's, and Jackson tells him he isn't. He just came to tell him about the rad roach in the pantry. Felipe panics and runs into the pantry, and Jackson follows him, closing the door and engaging the lock on the nearby terminal. He can hear Felipe banging on the other side of the door to be freed. Finding the freezer, Jackson unlocks it with a key and meets Ted Gunderson. He tells Jackson his dad will kill him and all the other Gloves. When Jackson says he's rescuing him instead, Ted snootily says he took too long, asking who took him. Explaining the Gloves intended to eat him, Ted is disgusted at the idea and says his father will get rid of the white hats. Jackson then explains that it was just Mortimer and a select few instead, but Ted says they're all the same. Jackson then threatens to leave him behind if he doesn't listen, and he says he'll be good. Escorting him out, Jackson walks him past Mortimer and hears him yell about having him filleted. Bringing Ted back to Heck, he gets up from his seat in disbelief and turns to Jackson, hoping he didn't harm the perpetrator because he wants to. Jackson tells Heck about Mortimer and his cannibalism. He vows to never do business with them again and will let the people of Vegas starve. Jackson then points out doing so would just produce more cannibals, and Heck says the strip has a stench, but agrees to not punish the innocent. He then hands Jackson 500 caps for saving his son and telling him not to go postal. Back with Walter, Jackson tells him about Heck's son and says causing any more pain will just give Heck an excuse in the future. To this, Walter concedes. Things won't change without someone being the good guy, and promises to take Ethel home to spend a worthy life together. Reporting he solved the White Gloves cannibalism problem to Yes Man, Jackson wants to keep them around. But Yes Man is just glad he wasn't eaten. Jackson walks up to a hooker outside of Gamora's and tries to keep eye contact. She tells him there's more waiting for him inside, and he enters Gamora with more than just his eyes pointing upward. At the door, Jackson is stopped by an Omerta thug, and he hands over his guns. Talking with the receptionist, she tells him about the Brimstone Club, the casino, and the courtyard behind it. Jackson then brings up a large tab in exchange for information on the Omertas. She sighs, knowing it would happen one day. She says talking to Caccino is the best option because he's the lowest lieutenant, and the girls have told stories of his other businesses. Jackson turns around to look for him, only to find Caccino overhearing the conversation and says he heard him asking questions. Jackson then says he heard about his side business, and Caccino asks which business specifically. Jackson says the non-family one, and Caccino stomps away. Looking for Caccino's room, Jackson enters an elevator to the suites level and meets Clandon. Asking what he does around the place, he says a little of a lot, and he got the room by being a close friend with the family as a contractor. On the same floor, Jackson finds a locked room and picks the lock. Opening the door, he sees a room full of medical supplies. Walking to the courtyard, Jackson meets a frail hooker named Joanna. She says he followed his desires just to meet her and asks if he has what it takes. Jackson replies in a suave manner. Liking his confidence, she asks what he wants from her. He wants answers, and she's happy to help. She says Gamora is a paradise in the desert, and the clients, military men, ranchers, tradesmen, they all come for what the Omertas provide. When Jackson asks her about the Omertas, Joanna recommends he stop while he still has 2 heads. Jackson then asks about her, and she describes herself only as the best lay. He asks if she likes being there, and she says that she likes that he's there. Jackson ends up walking away shortly after due to talking in circles with her. He then spots Caccino sitting alone enjoying a show. Jackson sneaks up behind him and searches his pockets. He comes across his journal and reads a detailed ledger of deals he made over many months, including chems and weapons, all in secret from the Omertas. He also details his use of prostitutes, most notably Joanna, stating every entry will be his last. Jackson confronts Caccino, but when he asks why he's being bothered again, Jackson adopts a mobster mentality and an accent after putting on Benny's suit.
Fuck do you want?
I found this ledger that proves some of your side business.
Showing Caccino the journal ledger, he's left frazzled and says it's dangerous information that could get him killed. Jackson asks if he thinks the family would like to see it, and he says he'll make it worth giving it back by helping him stop the bosses. Mr. House and the NCR both wanted dirt on the Omertas, and only he can get it. Talking with Big Sal, Jackson asks what sort of business he does, and he answers rhetorically, "What do you think a hotel does?" Jackson then asks why they stopped buying guns from Mick and Ralph's, and he tells him to stop digging any deeper. Back with Caccino, Jackson asks if the journal is worth 100 caps to him. He says he can pay it and give up the information. As they exchange items, Caccino spills that his bosses Big Sal and Nero have been working on their plan for a while. They're arming their men like an army, using a man named Troik and the specialist Clandon, and he hands Jackson a Zorora club key. Jackson asks who they are, and he says Clandon's too nice of a guy not to be hiding something, while Troik is smuggling in large shipments of weapons, but only when he isn't huffing chems or humping hookers. The bosses currently have him in their clutches after covering up his murder of a hooker when he was on a psycho trip. Finding Troik in the lower levels, he immediately spouts out that he didn't do anything. Jackson says Caccino sent him for some guns, and he suspects Caccino is just trying to get him killed. Then Jackson tells him it's the opposite, and he wants to break up the boss's plans. Troik says he can't due to his contract, so Jackson asks him about the murder. Even he can't believe what he did himself. One night he took some chems like normal, then suddenly blacked out. He woke the following day to find her next to him, stabbed to death. Jackson asks if he knows where the knife came from, and he admits to always having kept a switchblade on him. He then asks about the drugs he took, and Troik recounts using Buff Out, a little jet, and whiskey. As usual, Jackson comments saying it's a lot, But Troik says it isn't for him. When he woke up and saw her, he screamed, and that's when the family rushed in to clean it up. They offered to stay quiet for more guns at a discount. Looking for Clandon again, Jackson can't seem to find him, but he does discover a blood-stained carpet in his room. Then Jackson talks with Big Sal again, this time about Troik. He asks if Troik wants more Jet or more girls, then asks if he wants to try a guy this time. Jackson changes the topic to his contract, and he just chuckles. Jackson then says Troik is more trouble than what he's worth to them, and he agrees to cutting him loose.
I needed 54 experience, right? If I had met you before, while I was well rested, would that have worked? You've got to be fucking busting my balls here.
Telling Troik the good news, he's in disbelief and agrees to help Jackson out. He has a friend in the NCR send them crates marked as food and meds and keeps the guns in the basement, but doesn't know why and says it can't be for a good reason. Troik says for fun, he's been making thermite if the Omertas were to ever turn on him, and hands it to Jackson, but he shoves it right back, telling him to plant it himself to not rat on him. He curses Jackson out but agrees to do it, telling him to leave the casino before detonation. Jackson has another meeting with Joanna, and he flirts with her. She says he's earned a ticket on the house, but he panics and refuses to use it in fear of getting banned on YouTube. Instead of talking in circles, Jackson gets her to trust him, and she guides him to her private room. Once inside, she lights a cigarette, and they have a private chat about the Omertas. She calls them SOBs and says that they run the place as a hub to exploit the weak, whether they be customers or employees. She says Nero's the alpha, Big Sal is his right hand, and that Cachino is a filthy monster who does things to her and other acts under the Omerta's noses. Jackson then runs upstairs again and picks the lock to Clandon's room and finds him inside. He tells him that Cachino sent him, but Clandon only knows him by name. When he turns his back, Jackson picks his pocket and steals his room key. Using the key, Jackson opens a door to find a dead, mutilated prostitute in a torture room. He tries to inspect the body, but can only discern she's covered in stab wounds. Jackson then steps out of the casino and expects a boom, but it never comes, so he walks back in and talks with Cachino. He says Troik did melt the guns but was caught. Despite ratting Jackson out, he was still shot in the head, and the bosses are now looking for him. Cachino says the next move is to kill the heads of the snake, because if they aren't, they'll just restart. They ordered for him to bring the perp in, and he knows they'll be together when he does. Cachino says he'll give Jackson a gun and they'll kill them together. Following him up the stairs, Jackson enters the room, and Cachino slips a 12-gauge shotgun under his shirt. Nero invites him to take a seat on the couch, and Jackson sits down. Big Sal says he should already know why he's in there, and Jackson says, because they lost some guns? Big Sal calls him a weasel who only slowed them down, but didn't stop them, and will now die of failure. But Jackson stands and says it's his time to die instead, blasting both Big Sal and Nero's heads off. Returning to Yes Man, he calls Jackson a hero after telling him about the Omerta's plan to destroy the Strip. Following a road to the northeast, he sees a sign saying danger spray painted with the word boomers. Jackson continues down the road and meets a man named George, telling him to stop or he'll get blown up. He then says he will give him a hint for a cost, and Jackson tells him words better come out of his mouth before a boot goes in. George is a gambling man and says beyond the warning signs live the boomers, people who use the Nellis artillery on trespassers. For a wager, he knows a way through, but Jackson must pay 300 caps first. If he returns alive, George will pay double. Jackson slaps down 300 caps, and he hands him a note called Nellis Artillery Details and says timing is important. Reading the note, the key is to move from building to building to the northwest toward the front gate using the high cover of buildings and then sprint toward the gate. The boomers won't shoot at their own people, so Jackson must remain at the fence line. The note also mentions an old train tunnel, but the safety is unknown.
Before I take even a step out there, I'm saving, because I don't know what I'm waiting for. Grenades. Like, how far out do they start throwing the grenades and shit? Whoa! Okay. It's gonna get really stupid really fast. Oh boy. Holy shit. Gone. Yep, gone. What? What buildings would supply cover enough? If I stay hidden, will they still throw shit at me? I think they ran out. Gone.
Looking for the train station, Jackson can see a Deathclaw in the distance, which smells him and Veronica. He runs to open the station door only to find out it's locked and he's unable to pick it. Nuts! Okay. Jackson injects some Med-X to reduce any incoming pain and runs in. As the artillery rains down, he's put off balance, but manages to run undercover in a destroyed house. He then waits for the bombardment to end and sprints to the fence and hugs it until he gets to a gate. A boomer guard commands Jackson to stop moving, aiming a missile at him. Jackson tries to assure him that he's not attacking, and the guard tells him to wait for Raquel to arrive. A little later, Raquel introduces herself as the Master-at-Arms. Jackson then asks her what her position is, and she says she's the overseer of defenses, but won't take his weapons as a right of trust. Their elder, Mother Pearl, wants to speak with him, someone who has lived in Nellis from the start and always knew she would one day speak with a savage. Jackson agrees to meet her, and Raquel ushers him to meet Pearl. She jokes about Jackson taking his time, and he asks if he was prophesized, and she flatly says they aren't religious idiots. She's just glad he arrived before the armies did, because knowing the impending threat is coming, they need to change their ways. Jackson asks how he can help her, and she says, in a lot of ways, but wants him to start small to introduce outsiders to her people. He needs to understand that this is their first contact with the outside world, and those younger than her think it best to keep them away with guns. But Pearl wants them to accept outsiders before becoming victims. Jackson asks how to start, and she lifts off a few of the young ones. Raquel has a bug problem, Doc Argyle needs help with the wounded, and Loyal and Jack need repairs done. Then she mentions Jackson can hear the town's history from Pete at the museum. Welcoming him to Nellis, Pearl says he can come and go freely to show her trust. Entering the women's barracks, Jackson talks with Raquel. She tells him the spotters have been ordered not to fire on him, but warns him not to abuse his privilege. She says their power failed a few days ago because some giant ants nested in the generator room. A team was sent in to exterminate them, but were either wounded or killed. Jackson says he can handle some ants, but she says it's worse than he thinks because they're eating gunpowder and explode after taking any incendiary damage. She says he can still shoot them, but doing so, he might end up hitting an artillery shell. Loyal is currently working on a special weapon for them, and Raquel gives him the Nellis generator key. Walking into the medical station, Jackson meets Argyle, but he's too busy to talk because of all the patients. He has 3 patients who are wounded from the giant ants in the generator room, and they've stabilized, but aren't doing well. Lacking any actual medical knowledge, Jackson makes up words to sound smart, and Argyle falls for the lie. Looking at the patients, the first needs his leg amputated, but improper care will kill him. The second's face and neck are swollen, thus restricting his breathing. Any improper care will kill him. And patient 3 has a serious infection. He's going to die if Jackson even touches him. Entering Loyal's house, he's skeptical of Jackson just for being an outsider, but says he can be swayed by fixing the solar panels on the generator building rooftop. It's not a complicated job, it's just too far for him to walk to. Plus, the ants are there too. Jackson then tells him the solar array at Helios 1 might have some spare parts, and he asks if that was the source of the bright light blast he saw. Dodging his question, Jackson asks about his weapon for the ants, and he says he's making a sonic emitter, but he doesn't know the right frequency to use to kill them. Then, Jackson, being a bug nerd, says a sound wave above 22,000 Hz and above 150 decibels will work. Loyal calls him smarter than himself because he was always looking for an exact frequency. He sets the emitter to 24,000 Hz and gives it to Jackson, telling him to place it next to the nest. The sound will be too high for him to hear it, but it might induce some nausea. Jackson then walks into the Boomer Museum and is greeted by a young boy eager to share their history. Pete is the current keeper of the story after his predecessor, Don, drunkenly found a landmine. Jackson accepts his offer to learn. Pete then points to the museum's wall showing a large mural and says he's the first outsider to ever hear it. Guiding him over to the wall, their story begins underground in Vault 34, having access to munitions aplenty, but they couldn't use them indoors. They would later leave the vault and be attacked by savages, defending themselves with grenades and flamethrowers. They needed a new home, and Nellis answered, letting them prosper, secluded away, bombing any who approached. Until Jackson, of course. Nellis offered them new knowledge. They learned how to fly aerial bombers and where to find one. The last image tells of their future, restoring the bomber and raining explosive ordnance. Veronica comments that their story reminds her of the Brotherhood of Steel's past. Pete then asks if Jackson has any questions, and he questions why they left the vault in the first place. He believes they left because they were bored of not using their supply of munitions. Jackson commends their risk for freedom, and he's surprised they found Nellis to be empty. Pete explains that the base was highly radioactive years ago, so the savages avoided it, and Jackson surmises his ancestors used the vault-tec Geiger counters to avoid radiation. They survived, cut off from others by being self-sufficient, getting water from Lake Mead, power from solar arrays, and growing their own crops. Jackson commends them on their ingenuity, and Pete says it's their community's pride. He then asks why howitzer anti-aircraft guns would be inside an Air Force base, and Pete says they weren't there originally. They found them in a depot called Area 2, miles away, and it took weeks to bring them back home. Jackson asks how Nellis taught them to fly, and Pete says after establishing power, they discovered the high-tech chairs that they were using as beds were actually VR simulators used to train combat pilots. He preemptively adds Jackson isn't allowed to use them. He instead asks about the bomber they found, and Pete says Loyal found a file with articles, photos, and a map telling of a bomber crashing into Lake Mead in 1948. The photos show it's still intact, and the map shows the location, but they haven't left Nellis in decades. Jackson wishes he could see it airborne again, and Pete says he might be able to help Loyal recover it. In the hangar, Jackson meets Jack, who thought savages spoke a different language. He works with Loyal in electronics and robots. He's a great man, but an old one, so he's teaching him everything. Jack begins to mention that he could help him recover the lady, then changes the topic. But Jackson pokes further. He says Pearl will tell him instead, when it's acceptable. Jackson then asks if he can help him, and he says they do need new scrap metal because they normally just recycle everything. But then he asks if he can help with a personal matter outside, before cutting himself off. Jackson comforts him, saying outside of Nellis, it's normal to discuss personal matters. Jack responds well and says it must be nice not to be embarrassed, and tells Jackson about a girl. Jackson is intrigued, and Jack gets more energetic talking about her. She has red hair and is beautiful, and he wants Jackson to talk to her for him. But then he spirals into bad hypothetical scenarios. Jackson manages to calm him down, and Jack hands him his love note. And thus, Jackson starts his Nellis aid escapades by heading to the generator building and unlocking the door with the key. He takes out some of the ants with his silenced pistol and jumps along the catwalk. Descending onto the bottom floor, he finds and kills more ants with Veronica's help. They find a large ant mound with clutches of eggs and set the emitter on top of it. Jackson activates the sonic emitter, hearing the speakers make a static noise, and the remaining ants simultaneously explode. On his way out, Jackson resets 2 generators and a breaker, which turn the facility lights on. He climbs onto the roof and finds a broken solar reflector. The panels are damaged, but they can be repaired. Just not by him. Jackson reports back to Raquel, and she says she'll send someone to remove the remaining eggs and perform any remaining repairs. Jackson then heads out of Nellis to do his other tasks, but stops to see George again. He admits he lost and brings out 600 caps. But Jackson suggests an additional 100 cap tip to not tell the boomers about adjusting their aim, and he walks away with 700 caps. Jackson walks over to the Crimson Caravan and meets the red-haired woman tending to some Brahmin. He asks Janet if she's ever looked out toward Nellis, and she says she watches them a lot with her binoculars. He tells Janet about her secret admirer in Nellis, and she asks if it's the handsome blonde boy. Jackson says Jack sees her as his true love, and she finds it sweet and wants to meet him. Jackson tells her he'll ask Pearl for an exception to be made, and she gets excited. Reporting back to Pearl, he tells her about Jack's crush from the Crimson Caravan. She says they tried to contact Nellis, but they had no interest in trading before. The problem is, Jack can't leave, and Janet won't survive the welcoming gift. But Jackson pleads on Jack's behalf, and she agrees to give him a chance at love, but he needs to take up the responsibility. Telling Jack about Janet reciprocating his feelings and getting the clearance for her to come, he grabs a spare set of boomer clothes and tells him to give them to Janet. This will be the sign he uses for the gunners to know of her arrival. Walking back to the caravan, he hands her the boomer outfit, but she says if she leaves, she'll lose her wages from the contract she's in. Janet asks Jackson to speak with Alice McLaverty instead of her. Talking with Alice about Janet's contract, she already knows about her infatuation and why Jackson is asking for her departure instead. She says Janet is free to leave, but doing so will break her contract. Jackson then dons his best suit and smooth talks Alice.
Excuse me for a moment. I'm just getting naked, is all.
My terms haven't changed. Janet is free to leave, but she forfeits the wages she's owed.
Are you really going to ruin what's supposed to be a time of happiness for her?
This works, and she says she'll pay her as a honeymoon gift. He returns to Janet and tells her the good news. Thanking him, she puts on the boomer outfit and runs toward Nellis. Returning to the hangar, Jackson finds the lovebirds talking. It's awkward, but endearing. Janet asks if she's allowed to stay with him, and Jack says he'll put in a request for her to get a place in the women's barracks. He then turns to Jackson and thanks him for changing his life. Jackson then walks all the way to Helios 1's solar array and finds some discarded broken solar panels, but he doesn't know what to do with them. He reads through a magazine about fixing things and learns just enough to salvage some of the panel's parts. He has to run from panel to panel though, before he forgets what he just read. Returning to the Nellis solar array, he uses the Helios' salvaged panels to repair the array. Reporting this to Loyal, he's impressed by an outsider, and finishing this task, Jackson is idolized in Nellis. Talking with Pearl, she commends Jackson on earning the trust of Nellis and says it's time for him to learn about Nellis' dream. From Loyal, he says that they can finally talk about the lady in the water. Loyal tells Jackson about the sunken bomber and another non-functioning B-29 bomber in a museum they reclaimed for parts. He's had a dream about raising the lady ever since he was young and plans to do it by attaching a deployable ballast and floating it to the surface. He then hands Jackson a remote detonator, 2 ballasts, and shows him where the plane is in Lake Mead on his Pip-Boy.
Where the hell is Lake Mead, honestly? Oh.
Jackson asks how he's meant to enact this plan without drowning, and Loyal says by holding his breath for long enough. Then he mentions Jack was working on a rebreather before, and Jackson turns to talk with him.
Yo, Mr. Playboy. How we doing?
I've never been so happy in my entire life.
Jack says he would only need the parts from a pressure cooker to finish building it, but Jackson, not looking to waste time, lists off some substitute parts, and Jack uses those instead to finish the rebreather. Following a set of train tracks to Lake Mead's waterfront, Jackson can see Fortification Hill in the distance. He walks up to the boat launch, puts on the rebreather, and walks further into the lake. Swimming along the lake bottom, he finds the bomber and attaches both ballasts to the underside of the plane. Jackson returns to the shore and hears Loyal's detonator beeping in his pocket. He brings it out and pulls the trigger. He hears an explosion under the water and sees the B-29 breach the surface. Jackson makes his way back to Loyal and gives him the detonator back. He's going to send their robots out to disassemble it and bring it back to Nellis, piece by piece. Reporting back to Pearl, she says Jackson has performed a miracle for her people and has earned the trust of Nellis. With this, they will answer any of Jackson's wishes, and he asks if they'll aid him in the future battle of Hoover Dam. Pearl says the young ones would happily join him just to put their skills to work. Telling Yes Men about gaining the Boomer support, he says they'll only blow up the right people now. Jackson sets out to find the Brotherhood of Steel, nestled in Hidden Valley, and finds signs that read "Trespassers will be shot." He continues on and finds a large fence gate. Opening it, Jackson walks in cautiously, but he only sees random rocks until he stumbles upon a bunker door. Stepping inside, Veronica tells him she'll handle it and talks to the intercom about a fast food order. A voice on the intercom says they gave her a password for safety purposes. She then threatens Ramos teasingly, and he gives in, welcoming her back. Jackson follows her inside and meets Paladin Ramos, who's only allowing him in because of Veronica. He says the Elder wishes to speak with Jackson and gives him directions to his office. Jackson then asks about the rules surrounding entering and leaving, and he says while they're under lockdown, only those who are permitted can. But if someone was outside before the lockdown, they are forbidden to return. Jackson follows the directions to the Elder's office and meets Elder McNamara. He thinks Jackson can be useful to him, but gives him the chance to refuse his plea. Jackson blindly agrees to help, and he says the bunker is under lockdown with only a few being allowed to enter. Teams are dispersed for missions, but 3 of them have gone missing. The news of their disappearances haven't spread yet, and to keep the peace while trying to avoid breaking lockdown code, he needs to send someone to discover the circumstances. Jackson believes he isn't the best person for the job, but the Elder prefers someone with less connections to avoid traumatizing any brothers that didn't know beforehand. Jackson then agrees to help, and he appreciates it. The Elder then gives him 3 holotapes to learn the team's original assignments, because the Brotherhood's bunker shielding disrupts their positions. But they will appear once Jackson resurfaces. He wants him to return the parties alive, but if they aren't, they're holotapes. The Elder then permits him to access their scavenged equipment, but nothing that's deemed prohibited. Jackson then asks about the lockdown, and he explains it was enacted after their defeat at Helios 1 to plan for a new strategy. They later discovered the NCR presence had grown, unbeknownst to them, thus leading to them extending their lockdown. Jackson then asks what they do for supplies, and he explains that they send personnel out for trade, but they're only allowed to leave when a sandstorm is active. Jackson finds this odd, having not seen one, and the Elder says it acts as a basic defense camouflage, but just at night, for extra assurance. Jackson leaves the Elder, but is stopped by Head Paladin Hardin, saying Jackson can be useful to him, too. He doesn't know what he discussed with Jackson, but he suspects the Elder is the center of their troubles. He also talks about the lockdown, but adds that most of the Brotherhood has been sealed inside for years, while those outside are forbidden to return. Morale is plummeting, all because of the Elder's order. The only way to change it is to install a new Elder. Jackson asks about Veronica's access, and he says she's a goods runner, but believes he'll soon shut them away too. He asks if Hardin has brought this to the Elder's attention, and he says he did because of McNamara's open door policy, but he won't heed his advice. He deems the Elder to be a failure for watching the Brotherhood weaken, and he needs to be replaced. Jackson asks how he could get it done, but he doesn't know, because he can't find any records that could dismiss an Elder, and only those likely to know will support the Elder anyway. That's why he wants Jackson to ask around instead, even to the Elder himself. Jackson asks what he would gain from helping him, and he says he'll lift the lockdown, patrols will be sent out, and it would be beneficial to be an ally of the Brotherhood of Steel. Jackson says he'll look into it, and Hardin recommends that he talk with Ramos first for his knowledge on protocols, and then looking into the data store because he heard Scribe Ibsen is having an issue with it. Hardin then adds if the Elder gives him a task, to inform him immediately. Jackson enters the data store first and meets Scribe Ibsen, but he says he's too busy to talk, pauses, and then says it's no use anyway. He can't access the data system because when they tried cataloging a scavenged data disk, they discovered it held a virus that shut down the system. The virus is scrambling the terminals, but only those within the data store. The entire system is infected, but it only appears on 3 at a time and then moves at random. Jackson will need to find all 3 in under a minute because it will jump after that time and reset. Ibsen says he'll know he's found an infected terminal by finding real data instead of just corrupted files. He's decrypted the data as the virus coder leaving a taunt. When Jackson finds one of these taunts, he'll need to lock it down and find the next. Jackson agrees to help, and Ibsen says he'll keep watch of when it resets. He walks over to a terminal and starts a timer. Jackson runs around looking for the virus, only to find corrupted files. And Ibsen says it's jumped. Jackson tries again and manages to find 2 of the terminals before it jumps. But the problem here is that the time between when Ibsen starts the clock and the virus jumps isn't a minute. Looking at his audio in my editing software, the second line is said only after 40 seconds, making this annoyingly harder. After 20 minutes of attempts, Jackson freezes all 3 terminals, and Ibsen says the virus has been purged. He grants Jackson access to them for helping him, but only the non-classified topics. Jackson asks how he can get access to the higher level topics, and he explains that a senior level member would need to unlock it for him, and most of them are under Ramos's jurisdiction, but he's unlikely to give it up. Jackson then asks for his opinion on Hardin replacing McNamara. He understands Hardin's thinking, because he too dislikes their current period of stasis. Opening the terminal data store, Jackson is only allowed to read the bunker information. Their goal is to be a self-sustaining shelter, capable of withstanding a bunker-busting weapon. The system overview states it relies on 2 systems, the Candle fusion power for all in-bunker needs, and the Dervish camouflage to prevent ranged assaults by obscuring the base. Jackson then talks with Ramos and asks what an Elder could do to be removed. He surmises that Hardin has talked to him and says he's been trying to usurp the Elder ever since the lockdown began. While Hardin is a good man, the Elder protected the survivors of Helios. He's already told Hardin about the few rare cases of Elders being dismissed, but all cases involved crimes the Elder just wouldn't commit, so he permits Jackson to read them too. Asking about Helios, he guesses Jackson already knows about their time at the solar station, but not that they were under Elder Elijah's command at the time. He was obsessed with knowing more about something. but he was too late, and the NCR had surrounded the plant, outnumbering them. Elder Elijah was MIA, so McNamara assumed the position and saved the escapees. Jackson asks him about Elijah, and Ramos describes him as a bright guy, but off. The Brotherhood's mission is to preserve past technology, but Elijah wanted to improve it. And when he found Helios, he dreamed about a potential grand design. He wanted to establish a base there, despite the objections from every other paladin. Returning to the data store, Jackson reads the new file, Elder Dismissal Incidents. Raymond Lorne was removed for committing the murder of Senior Scribe Ritter, Kenneth Jones was removed for not following the chain that binds, and David James was removed for destroying recovered technology while also being unwilling to discuss his reasoning. Jackson returns to Ramos and asks him about the chain that binds, and he says it's an old principle from the founding of the Brotherhood of Steel. It states one must obey all orders of a superior. It's deemed common sense, but it's often invoked when people get pissy. He gives Jackson access to read more about it, and says he's the first person to read it willingly in decades. Returning to the data store, he reads the file Chain That Binds. It's a pillar of foundation for the Brotherhood of Steel for the reasons listed. 1. Orders must flow from top down. And 2. Order flow may not skip ranks. Reporting back to Hardin, Jackson asks if he knows about the chain that binds, and he says it's the first lesson taught to initiates. Jackson then tells him about the case about the Elder dismissal, and he believes it to be a dead end because the Elder does indeed follow orders, and hasn't issued any himself since Helios. Jackson then tells him about the second rule, and he didn't know failing to follow that rule was punishable. Now he just needs to find an instance of the Elder doing so. Jackson then asks Hardin why he dislikes the Elder, and he says he doesn't dislike him, but his leadership. After becoming the Elder, he aims to remove the lockdown and send teams out for reconnaissance according to their standard procedure, but even ex-Elder Elijah didn't follow them. He says Elijah was strange, and him becoming the Elder was too. Normally only paladins become the Elder, but he was a scribe and was given an exception for his genius, but he lacked the knowledge of battle tactics, which led to the loss at Helios, because he almost had something working. After the perimeter was broken, Elijah vanished. Jackson then decides to tell Hardin about the secret task he received from the Elder, and he says he knew about the mission, but he didn't know about him retrieving the mission discs and finds that odd. Jackson then discovers a VR simulation room, and hears Veronica start a catfight with Apprentice Watkins.
I'm surprised you're not wearing that hood to hide your hair like you usually do, Veronica.
Oh, I recognize your voice. Oh, who is your voice actor?
Yeah?
Is this the voice actor for Amy in the Sonic games? that just threw me back. Jackson, for some reason, asks why she isn't in school, and she says head scribe Taggart requested for her to be his assistant after seeing the results on her VR testing, but she does miss the other students. The VR training hall is used to retain combat experience during their lockdown. She grew up in the Brotherhood, having a scribe father and a paladin mother. After both were killed at Helios, her fellow brothers became her new family. She doesn't know who she's more like, or which road to follow. She's currently an apprentice and is eligible to become a journeyman after joining the Knights or the Scribes. The Knights are in charge of building and maintaining equipment while also going outside for patrol or assisting paladins. Meanwhile, the Scribes are in charge of researching old technology and sometimes inventing new ones. Jackson decides to hit the road and follow the holotape signals, and when he steps outside, he sees the Dervish sandstorm has activated. Upon leaving the sandstorm, he encounters a small hut, and suddenly hears a voice call out to him. He whips around to see it belongs to a mutant from behind a rock. Neil warns him of the dangerous area ahead and asks if he's heard her on the radio. But Jackson doesn't listen to music, in fear of the copyright devil. The broadcaster is Tabitha, the supreme commander of Black Mountain, or what she calls the state of Utobitha. She took control of Black Mountain 2 years ago, and it's where super mutants live freely and humans are killed on sight. Jackson hears the disdain in his voice and asks if he wants help. He says helping him might just make a difference and tells Jackson to meet him in a village at the peak, if he's able to reach it. As Jackson walks up the cliffside, he sees the radio tower and begins to feel his skin tingle from radiation, so he swallows a Rad X pill to reduce his exposure. Seeing a group of super mutants marching down the cliff, he hides behind a nearby trash heap and watches the party pass. As he crests the hilltop, Jackson finds Neil waiting for him. He's ready to start his plan, and says the gate to Tabitha's compound is guarded by Nightkin, so he'll draw them away by telling them he spotted an intruder, and that's when Jackson will sneak in. Jackson then points out that he is intruding, and Neil states that's exactly why he needs to stay out of sight,
and runs up the hill. The band of Nightkin come running down, and because Veronica couldn't hear Neil, she charges at them head first into a flamethrower and burns to death. Jackson kills the remaining Nightkin and sneaks up to the compound alone, but when he arrives at the gate, he's greeted by an explosion at his feet. He takes up cover behind some rocks, and when he pokes his head out, he sees a Nightkin sniper above him. In that moment, Jackson sees his second life flash before his eyes, and it ends with a bullet to the brain.